Welcome, everybody. I think we're going to begin momentarily. So let me just start out by telling you that it's my pleasure to welcome each and every one of you to a very special event. We're entitling this Fair Housing Matters, the Challenges of Housing Access in a Racially Divided Nation During COVID-19. My name is Toma, and I'm honored to serve as the president of IAOHRA. IAOHRA stands for the International Association of Official Human Rights Agencies. Because that's a mouthful, we just will use the acronym IAOHRA, and that you're going to hear that quite a bit during the day. I'm speaking to you from Los Angeles County, where I serve as the executive director of the county's Human Relations Commission. And I'm also assistant director of Workforce Development, Aging, and Community Services, overseeing our Human Relations branch. And I will say that I'm proud to represent LA County because our elected leadership and entire county government has made equity and uniting against hate top priorities of our county government. It's no secret that we have a lot to do to address some of these daunting problems, such as homelessness, racial inequities, a rise in hate crimes. But we know that fair housing is so fundamental a right that it is something that we need all of us to be focused on. So our event today is organized for you in three dimensions of this topic. The first session is on unique fair housing issues presented by COVID-19. The second session will be on best agency practices in the age of the pandemic. And session 3 will be on fair housing and COVID-19 as seen through race and gender equity lenses. Today's event is presented to you by IAOHRA, which really is the only network of state, county, city, governmental human rights agencies in the United States, Canada, and Mexico, which represents the interests of all of our vital agencies. After all, we're the ones who are mandated to protect those minorities who are vulnerable to having their human and civil rights ignored, especially when it's unpopular. And when we last calculated, IAOHRA member agencies represented over 250 million people throughout its governments and jurisdictions. So if you aren't already a member, I invite you to go to IAOHRA.org and learn more about how to join our network of collaboration, mutual support, innovation, and advocacy. Now, we know that there are so many people in this country who are so challenged and their lives are at risk because they don't have a safe place to live, a healthy place to live, and they're being denied the right to live where they choose because of discriminatory attitudes, which comes from both explicit and implicit biases. For me, this is really more than just a professional topic, it's personal. Before the Fair Housing Act was passed in the 60s, my father, who had come to this city of Los Angeles, after having been born and raised in a sugarcane plantation in Hawaii, he found himself here looking for a place for his new family. He called a place that in a neighborhood and city that he liked and told that the apartment was available to come by and see it. When he arrived and knocked on the door, once the owner saw what he looked like, that he was of Okinawan Japanese ancestry, of Asian background, he was told it's no longer available. Now, my father knew what was happening and it sent a message to him about that community. We didn't try to and didn't end up living in that community. But when you reflect on this, on all of these acts of discrimination, it's not just that one act. That single act of discrimination was life-changing. It meant we ended up living in another neighborhood and city, and that changed the path of our lives, what schools we would go to, who our neighbors were, the kinds of opportunities for developing ourselves and our relationships. All of you, obviously care about this incredibly important topic. And many of you are Fair Housing Assistance Programs, FAPs, who are enforcing anti-discrimination laws in housing, and FIPS as well. All of you agencies that do the critically important work of protecting the fundamental right of housing free from discrimination. And really, you are the backbone of our country's human rights infrastructure in housing. Today is a great opportunity to strengthen our role, to understand how we can fulfill it more effectively, in face of the pandemic conditions which threaten our human right to housing, both in terms of what the issues are and how we can do this without spreading the virus. I have to admit, I'm a little sad today because this week was one where we should have been all together in person here in Los Angeles for our annual IAOHRA conference. And although that's not possible, I'm excited by the fact that today's event will bring you such invaluable information and insight that we need during this experience. Even better, we can do this with all the country without any adverse impact or risk to our environment or health. So there cost and travel challenges and restrictions, we know that we actually have hundreds more of you joining us today. So it's exciting to give you the special welcome to all of our IAOHRA members. For those who aren't, please don't join us. Go to IAOHRA.org and learn more about us. Now, today's event would not be possible without the support and partnership of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. And we're grateful for that. I'm very pleased to now introduce to you our next speaker, the leader of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity at HUD, Assistant Secretary Ana Maria Farías.
We are trying to get Ms. Assistant Secretary Farías on the phone right now. Please hold.
Okay.
Hey guys, this is Victor again. I just heard from her and she says she's on the line, so not quite sure what's going on.
Perhaps while she's working on that, shall we move to our the following speaker and come back to her when she's able to join us? We'll wait a few more seconds here. And then perhaps we'll advance to the next speaker and then come back to her when she's able to join us.
Mr. Pelletier, are you ready to go on and in place until we can get the Assistant Secretary on the line?
I am ready if you would like me to.
Okay, so well, let me introduce you, Director Pelletier. So we also have a treat here with our Director of HUD's Fair Housing Assistance Program, Director Joseph Pelletier. So I want to give him an opportunity to share with you some remarks. Mr. Pelletier.
Good morning. Thank you, Robin. Good afternoon. Good morning to those of you out west. I want to thank all of you who are participating in this webinar. I especially want to thank the Pinellas County Office of Human Rights and the International Association of Official Human Rights Agencies for putting this webinar together. At the risk of sounding like that Captain Obvious guy from the TV commercials, COVID-19 has changed the world we live in. Certainly, maybe in a less profound way, it has changed our business practices, business processes, and the way we operate. I know we have a diverse audience with us today, but I want to speak to our fair housing enforcement partners, especially our Fair Housing Assistance Program partners, but also our FIP partners, and commend all of you on the way you have adjusted and responded to this pandemic and its effects on your operations. Virtually all of you, like HUD, were forced to operate in a 100% remote environment. Many of you did not have the assets to do so. Indeed, some of you had no historical agency practice of working remotely. It was a totally foreign concept to some of you. I am happy that HUD has been able to assist you by providing CARES Act funds to allow you to carry on the important work that we all do. To date, HUD has provided more than $1.4 million to our Fair Housing Assistance Program partners to secure technology assets that allow them to work effectively in spite of the pandemic, including computers, printers, web cameras, cell phones, and teleconferencing equipment that allow them to carry on the necessary and vital activities that they undertake on a daily basis. This is in addition to funding for other COVID-19 related activities, including education and outreach, COVID-19 related fair housing testing, and other activities. For that, I have to thank a few people: Lynn Grosso, Deputy Assistant Secretary David Enzel, and of course, FHO Assistant Secretary Farías, for working with the administration to secure this vital funding so that we could give it to our partners. And we are partners. And we always remember that we can't do the job of fighting housing discrimination without our FAPs and our FIPs. And so, as we continue to adjust to the changes wrought by this pandemic, I look forward to our partners continuing to do what it takes to conduct thorough, professional investigations of housing discrimination complaints in spite of the challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Pelletier. I don't know if we have the Assistant Secretary with us yet.
Yes, I have the Assistant Secretary on the line. Go ahead,
Fantastic.
Assistant Secretary.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. Good afternoon. I'm glad that I finally got my technical problems more or less taken care of. I'm from the Stone Age, so I don't even know how to pick up phones. But I was extremely happy. Mr. Robbins, that was the president of IAOHRA, and I want to congratulate him for being the executive director of the LA County Human Relations Commission. I want to thank our very able director, Joe Pelletier. You are extremely fortunate to have someone of his caliber, who not only is the director here of the FAP program, but he spent many years in the Office of General Counsel. So he already knows the way it works and the legalities of everything. For those of you that are new to FAP, welcome to my world. I don't know if you know, but in my previous life, I used to be a commissioner in the Texas Commission on Human Rights. And that's how we got to learn. I got to learn all about something from being a commissioner. But many, many decades ago, I don't even go into how many, I grew up in the housing project and then went back home to run the housing authority where I grew up and actually lived in the housing project during the 7 years that I was there. So you get to see a multitude of problems and eventually at times end up with pursue the facts. I want to very much thank the many directors and commissioners, representatives of FAP and FIP agency and human relations organizations, the multitude of attorneys and members of the real estate community that are participating in this extremely important conference, especially the very first one that is being done through phone and visual because of COVID. We thought we might be gone for 2-3 weeks, and here we are on the fourth month, and we don't know when it's going to end. However, HUD Secretary Ben Carson often talks about the importance of partnerships in addressing the nation's housing challenges. And I know that you have seen the Secretary on a multitude of national TV programs talking about fair housing. He always talks, let me emphasize, he always talks about the FAP agencies and 22,000 projects and cases that you resolve on a yearly basis. And the one thing he tells me, and the one thing that we know, is that when you ask for money, like you did for the COVID 1.5, and I think there's only $9,000 left because I've been authorizing for Joe. I get Joe's emails, by the way, at about 11:30 p.m., and they're approved by me at 11:31 p.m., and most of you are notified the next morning. The one thing that he talks about, and I showed him, is that when you, FABs, ask for money, we literally know to the penny how the money is being spent and what you're using it for, especially for COVID. And I'm glad that we could make a lot of money accessible to you for laptops, for computers, for phones, and things, since everybody now has to telework from home. So I want to thank you for the way you spend your money. And I told you when I was the commissioner, that's the way we did it, because we're answerable to the state and the governor. And this conference that you're having is the result of collaboration between the FAB partners, IAOHRA, and the FAB Care Fund. And we especially appreciate the critical role that all of you play in conjunction with the FIP organizations as well. Now, when I was a FAB commissioner, we had a lot of housing issues, but as well as employment issues. But now, one of the things that you're especially dealing with, that we're extremely proud of, is trying to listen and hear the cases that are coming to you as a result of COVID. One of the biggest ones, and I'm glad that it is being covered internationally, is the sexual harassment of people during COVID. You know, people are scary enough as it is, and then to be attacked, because we've had a couple of rape cases and assaults, or managers expecting sexual favors in return for not evicting people or even considering their application. And because of the work that FHO has done with the Secretary and with all the U.S. attorneys in the country, they have made it very clear that if anyone abuses this, they are beyond trouble. And a lot of them, quite a few, have already ended up in jail. And we're very proud and we'll continue to do that. But right now has gotten billions and billions and billions of dollars during COVID. And over $3 billion of that has gone to public housing to assist a lot of the folks so that they're not evicted, so that they have money for the daycare and the travel that they have to do. And I know that a lot of you are also getting a lot of these calls about, can I be evicted because of X, Y, and Z? We, of all the decades that you have been in office, I can assure you, we desperately need your help. We need you to constantly be the eyes and ears for the people that need us the most. And
Assistant Secretary, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted, this is Robin Toma, and I just wanted to ask if you might try to a different way to project your sound.
on the line, and you have a lot of questions. So I want to thank you for the incredible job that you're doing under very, very difficult circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary. Really appreciated those remarks. It was a little hard to hear, but I think through the static, we were still able to capture much of the of what you were saying. So we appreciate that. So I'm so sorry that I forgot to turn on my video. So with that, let me turn to our next speaker. We now have the first session that we're kicking off on unique fair housing issues presented by COVID-19. And our moderator is none other than Paul Valenti, the director of the Pinellas County Office of Human Rights in Florida, and also a longstanding member of our board of directors of IAOHRA, and a wonderful colleague. So with that, let me turn it over to Paul.
Thank you, Robin. I appreciate it very much. And good afternoon, fellow fair housing advocates across the United States. My name is Paul Valenti, as Robin mentioned. I have the honor of serving as the Human Rights Director in Pinellas County, Florida, and serving on the IAOHRA board as the Southern Region Representative. I also have the privilege this afternoon of kicking off our substantive discussions on fair housing issues related to COVID with a dynamic and impactful panel of co-panelists for this session. We are blessed to have with us this afternoon three of the finest fair housing experts across the land. Naming them in alphabetical order, we have Michael Allen, Attorney Michael Allen from the law firm of Relman, Colfax, LLC. We have with us Amy Nelson, the Executive Director of the Fair Housing Center of Central Indiana. And we have with us Professor Michael Seng from the University of Illinois, Chicago, John Marshall School of Law. I could go on and on about their credentials, the stellar work they've done in this field, but that would consume the 50 minutes we have, and I just don't want to do that. We want to get to the content. So going right into it, for the next 50 minutes, we're going to have an educational and spirited conversation on unique issues presented by COVID-19, such as requests for reasonable accommodation, undue burden, threats to others during a pandemic, and which protected classes may have seen increased incidents of discrimination due to COVID-19. Near the end of our conversation, our panel of experts have graciously agreed to answer questions that we have solicited in advance from FIP and FAP agencies, from our IAOHRA members, and from others in advance. So with that, let's begin. So my first question, again in alphabetical order, would be to Attorney Allen. Attorney Allen, at what point do COVID symptoms amount to a handicap under the Fair Housing Act?
Paul, thanks for the question and thanks for the opportunity to be here today. I think the answer is we are still finding out. I want to remind us all that there is a framework that's always applied to the question of disability coverage under the Fair Housing Act. And specifically, in order to be covered, a claimant, a plaintiff would have to show a mental or physical impairment that substantially limited one or more major life activities. And HUD's regulations make clear to us, although it's not an exclusive list, that those major life activities include self-care, being able to perform manual tasks, walking, seeing, hearing, speaking, breathing, learning, and working. So in order to construct a claim that somebody with COVID-19 is a person with a disability, he or she would have to demonstrate that they meet those prongs of the definition. Now, we will recall that the definition of disability can apply to somebody who currently experiences those conditions, somebody who has a history of those conditions, or somebody who is regarded as having those elements, the mental or physical impairment, substantially limiting the major life activity. And it's important to understand that each individual case has to be taken on its own facts. So let's just state the obvious. Merely having a diagnosis of COVID-19 does not make somebody a person with a disability. It may be that it doesn't meet the first prong. It certainly isn't a mental impairment. It may not qualify even seriously as a physical impairment. It could very well be that even if you meet the first prong, that you don't have a condition that substantially limits you. We hear about people who are asymptomatic. We hear about people with mild symptoms. But people, obviously, who get further along with the disease and have more serious impairments may well qualify as a person with a disability. So I would say, I hate to say it, and lawyers always do, it depends. The facts of the individual case will make all the difference as to whether or not we even have a disability claim to discuss.
Thank you for laying that foundation for us. Given that, can you give us some examples of differential treatment in the time of COVID-19, which might give rise to liability under the Fair Housing Act?
Well, I think the ones that most obviously come to mind, and I'm sure that both FIPS and FAPS have been seeing this in terms of their own intake and advice over the course of the last several months. But, good example would be a landlord treating somebody who was an essential worker, somebody who, was clearly going out of the premises on a regular basis to maybe work in healthcare or to be a first responder, or somebody who worked in a grocery store or otherwise essential public service, might be treated differently. The assumption that that person is somehow more prone to contracting COVID, and a decision perhaps not to rent to such a person would be a form of intentional discrimination or disparate treatment on the basis of that apprehension. Now, again, recall, that person may not actually have COVID, may not have had COVID, but in that instance, there's somebody regarding him or her as somebody who would be subject to these, to COVID symptoms. Another might be the kind of impermissible inquiry that the Fair Housing Act and the HUD regulations specifically prohibit. That is, if you're making an inquiry that's exclusively of people you presume to have disabilities, that will violate HUD's impermissible inquiry regulation and constitute a violation of the Fair Housing Act. So those are two sort of practical examples that I'm sure resonate with our audience.
Thank you very much. Now, you just touched on some of the stigma that is associated with persons who are thought to have COVID-19. Is it possible that someone who is regarded as having that is regarded as handicapped and therefore is eligible for a reasonable accommodation under the Fair Housing Act?
I think you may get different opinions on this, but I've always been a bit of a purist here, and I read the cases that have construed the reasonable accommodation provision to say the accommodation is available to people who actually have the limitations related to the disability or to the handicap condition. If you are only regarded as having those conditions, if there is no underlying disability-related limitation that could be ameliorated by an accommodation, then such a person would not be entitled to an accommodation. So I think the theories available to somebody with COVID, unless we can show that they actually meet all of the definitions, are available only under the disparate treatment component and not the reasonable accommodation piece.
All righty, thank you very much. If I may, I'd like to turn now to another of our panelists, Director Nelson. Director Nelson, this session contemplates discussing protected groups which may be experiencing increased incidents of discrimination during the pandemic. And we heard earlier from Assistant Secretary Farías that HUD has a focus now on sexual harassment in relation to one's housing. We'll hear more about that as we discuss in the third panel, COVID-19 fair housing and race and gender equity lenses. But could you please tell us a little bit about what you may have been seeing on this front in your own work at the Fair Housing Center of Central Indiana?
Sure, thank you. And like with Michael, thank you so much for having me here today. On behalf of the Fair Housing Center of Central Indiana, we sincerely appreciate HUD and DOJ's intense focus on sexual harassment here in recent years. As somebody who is now getting to be one of the oldies in fair housing coming up on 25 years within fair housing, sexual harassment has always been there. It just has never gone away. It's been a problem for a long time. I've had several sexual harassment cases that my organization has litigated over that time period. It's a particular egregious and it's a harmful form of housing discrimination that impacts individuals for so very long. And we need to always remember very often there's a physical element to it where they may have also been physical harm that occurred. So it isn't just the mental anguish that somebody goes through as a victim of housing discrimination. Very often there may also be a physical component with it as well. So anytime we see the market kind of tested or strained, particularly when it comes to the ability of people to access or maintain their housing, we tend to see incidents such as sexual harassment increase, unfortunately. And COVID has certainly tested our market. It's impacted individuals' abilities to keep that safe and secure housing or obtain new housing. And sexual harassment is obviously part of that. Individuals have suffered extreme job loss across our country. They do not have sufficient funds to pay their rent. Some have been getting by, some have not as part of that process through government relief programs. And very often women in particular and female-headed households are particularly vulnerable to this type of harm and discrimination. Just this past week, my organization filed a smaller case involving sexual harassment in which our client had suffered COVID-related job loss, had notified her landlord, who she had been renting from for a period of time, had notified the landlord that she was probably going to struggle to pay next month's rent. And he responded by soliciting her for sex in exchange for that rent. So it's happening. We've seen the cases happening across our country, and we all need to report it. We need to provide support to those who are in positions where they feel that they don't have a choice within this, and be able to provide adequate resources. So again, I really appreciate HUD and DOJ, as well as my Fair Housing FIP and FAP partners out there who aggressively investigate and work to eliminate these forms of housing discrimination, because in my experience, you never catch the individual the first time they do it. They've been doing it for a significant period of time in most situations.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. As we all know, victims of sexual harassment can feel pressured to relent to advances out of fear of eviction, right, from their housing. That's one of the most severe impediments to seeking access to justice and relief is the fear of losing their housing. But with the onset of the COVID pandemic, many jurisdictions have implemented moratoria on evictions. What do you think is likely to happen as these moratoria expire? What data might you have and can share in relation to the expiration of such moratorium on evictions? And on what groups do you think we might see disparate impacts as these moratoria expire? In what ways might these be manifested in fair housing?
Sure. So I wish I could predict exactly what's going to happen. I fear that it's going to be absolutely awful in what is coming for us. Here in Indiana, our eviction moratorium expires tomorrow. The governor here has indicated that he is not going to extend the moratorium any further. And ours was on eviction, foreclosures, as well as utility turnoff as well. So that is all going to be expiring tomorrow. Our particular state, as well as a number of states, has implemented rental assistance programs to try to help people with job loss, COVID-related job loss, to get caught up on their rent or to pay their rent as part of that. But at least I can talk for here in Indiana, those programs have been absolutely overwhelmed. We have two rental assistance programs going here in Indiana. One is a statewide program, and then one is an Indianapolis-based program, as Indianapolis is the largest city in Indiana. Our statewide program in just under a month received 24,000 applications and is receiving on average 400 applications a day. They had originally thought that they could fund 12,000 applications. Literally within the first week and a half, they had already received more applications than they knew that they were going to fund. And Indianapolis was experiencing something similar. People, this is, again, much like with sexual harassment, what COVID has done is just expose the insecurities that were already out there. Individuals across my state, which is the state that I can talk most freely about, we're already housing insecure. There has been massive rent increases, and wages and jobs have not kept up with those costs of living. People have been forced to choose to live in substandard housing, to not complain about problems, to not complain about discrimination in order to keep a roof over their head. People have been roped into predatory transactions related to rent-to-own and land contracts, again, simply because they need a roof over their head. And COVID has again exposed these insecurities that our country, at least here in Indiana, have by just exasperating the problems that were there. And these housing insecurities are coming to light. one of my biggest worries is what's going to happen to an individual if they have an eviction on their record. We've seen at the national level that tenant screening companies are now being used by most middle to large size property management firms. These tenant screening companies do not consistently differentiate between a filed eviction, in which maybe wasn't justified, where the landlord and the renter work something out after the filing, or whatever it might be, and a court-ordered eviction by a judge. Those tenant screening companies do not distinguish between those differences. And the result is now when that individual goes to try to find new safe and affordable housing, they're shut out. They don't get that housing simply because they had an eviction filed against them. So what's going to happen when all these moratoriums expire is if evictions actually happen, which appears to be what is coming, that's a pandemic of its own that's coming to us, we're going to have individuals being haunted for years to come in their ability to find safe and secure housing for no reason that was their fault other than a health pandemic came and forced them to lose their jobs.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I'd like to now turn to Professor Seng, if I may, and continue that a little bit. Professor Seng, you too have insights on the impact of evictions within your home state of Illinois, particularly the potential ramifications which may arise merely because a person has an eviction action filed against them, the exact point that Director Nelson was just speaking to. Can you share with us a little bit more about that?
Yes, I would love to. And I first might say that it's a real pleasure to be here today, and I'm really happy about the turnout for this because this really is a very important topic. And as Ms. Nelson has stated, the crisis, we went through the foreclosure crisis in 2008 and beyond. I think there's things that we can learn from that because the eviction crisis that we are facing has many similar characteristics to what we faced after 2008. I would emphasize that there's no question about the impact on protected classes when it comes to evictions. Even before the pandemic, you had books like Matthew Desmond's Evicted Case, the study in Milwaukee, that showed the impact on people of color, particularly the impact on women, the impact on families with children, and the impact on people with disabilities. One thing I'm going to urge, and I'm getting to the answer to your question very soon, but one thing I would urge that fair housing groups not focus so much maybe as we did with the foreclosure crisis and trying to find disparate treatment, a disparate impact. Those take a long time, but to actually focus on problems that particularly affect people who are the subjects of eviction and try to remedy those. That does not mean that we're not going to have major cases where disparate impact against people of color, against women, disparate treatment occur, but I do think there's a number of things that we can do that will help us procedurally. You mentioned Illinois, and there's a number of recent things that have been done in Illinois regarding evictions that I think are positive. First of all, the Illinois Supreme Court has amended our practice rules. And other states may have this, but it was not the case in Illinois, where if you file a eviction complaint, you're now required to attach the notice, you're required to attach the demand, you're required to attach the relevant lease provisions. And obviously that will make it easier for people defending evictions to know precisely what is being relied on in the eviction action. Similarly, first the Mayor Lightfoot here in Chicago in July or in June, and recently in July, the city passed a zoning ordinance extending the time for a notice in an eviction action. Before that, for most matters, it was 30 days. And the new ordinance extends the time up to 120 days, depending upon how long somebody has lived in the property. So that is going to have an impact. The other thing that the ordinance does is to extend the right of cure. Before, people only had 5 days after a notice to pay their rent, or the eviction would proceed. Now they can pay any money that is owing up to the time of an order of possession. So again, those are not major things, and they're not specifically tied to the Fair Housing Act, but they will specifically help persons who are being evicted, and I think are positive, at least in the city of Chicago, and the Illinois Supreme Court rule will apply throughout the state of Illinois. Amy mentioned the problem of having evictions on your record. And in Illinois, the mere filing of a conviction, of an eviction, whether it is pursued or not, whether anybody shows up, whether the landlord even shows up in court or anything, is part of a person's record. That's what's reported by the reporting companies. And there's been legislation proposed in Illinois to seal those findings. And I think that is really crucial legislation here, because there's no question that once you're evicted, for many people that means homelessness or doubling up. It means bad credit, which makes it doubly hard to ever find housing in the future, and it is a black mark that continues against anybody in the future. So sealing of an eviction, I think, may well be an important remedy. The statutory proposal would also require automatic sealing after 3 years if there was a judgment. And so all of those things would presumably help a person who is faced with the subject of eviction. One other thing that I want to mention that I think is really important, and again, it goes beyond the Fair Housing Act, and that is the right to an attorney. That was brought out by Matthew Desmond in his book on evictions. And I think anybody who's studied evictions, the Lawyers Committee for Better Housing here in Chicago, other groups have studied evictions and show that while approximately 80% of landlords are represented by an attorney, somewhere around 10% or so of tenants ever are affected by an attorney. And the statistics show a major a difference if you come to court with an attorney, particularly with a legal aid attorney. That increases your chances of prevailing in an eviction action considerably. So one of the things that I hope that states and local governments and civil rights organizations and fair housing groups do is push for the presence of attorneys. I know that was a major problem in the foreclosure crisis. In many local governments established and help people to get an attorney. Help desks where law students and attorneys are available in the court to answer people's questions, I think are crucial. So those are things that may not be specifically tied to a protected class, but are procedural implementations that I think could make a major difference.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us, Professor. As a follow-up, I trust that I can speak for my panelists and well as the persons watching through the webinar, that although COVID's really only been in the United States for around 6 months, it really seems to have been forever. I almost can't remember the time before. Are you aware of any interesting case precedents which have developed in those 6 months? Or are there any cases out there, particularly under the Fair Housing Act, that might be percolating out through across the United States that you think are of interest, of note, or we ought to be aware of?
I'll jump in here quick and just say that, oh, I'm sorry, that was to Professor Seng.
Go ahead, Amy. That's fine. I
Sorry
defer to
about
you.
that. Not following my own note sheet here. I thought that was for all of us. Apologies. So one thing that I would like to reference, and then I'll turn it over to Professor Seng, is on this discussion of evictions, are we going to be able to show a fair housing case impact, i.e., is it going to show a disproportionate impact upon people of color, women, moms with kids, and people with disabilities? And that is potential area there. There was a case filed in Washington State a few years ago by the ACLU on that very topic. There haven't been a lot of other cases filed, but that certainly could be something coming in addition to additional action against tenant screening companies. There's a case currently pending out in Connecticut related to a tenant screening company there that just recently had a ruling, but potentially that might be another avenue as well. Sorry, Michael.
No problem. Just one case that I was going to mention, and then Michael may obviously have many others because he's more actively involved in the day-to-day practice of law. One case that was recently filed in the state of Illinois, and a federal judge issued a temporary restraining order, which is will be lasting till the end of or later in July, or in August, I should say, is a case involving foster children. And one of the big problems that the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services had is they had a large number of wards of the court. And many of them were faced with foster parents who may have tested positive, and the children had to be quarantined, or the children themselves had to be quarantined. So the state of Illinois went to Aunt Martha's housing group, which had a community residence in a Chicago suburb. And it had been approved by the city. It was allowed under the city's zoning ordinance, which covered minor wards of the state, youths between the ages of 18 and 24, persons with disabilities, and other groups qualified to live in these community residences. Up until the time of the pandemic, the home housed young people between the ages of 18 and 24, but with the pandemic, those people were moved out. The 18 to 24-year-olds were moved out of the home. The home was given a new ventilation system and was equipped to house minors who were adjudicated by the courts as wards of the state. And Aunt Martha's went ahead and, in addition to redoing the ventilation system, assembled protective equipment for all the staff, assembled a staff to take care of the young people who are going to be housed in that facility. Security, because these young people were under quarantine, to monitor any ingress or egress from the property. So they tried to do everything that would be provide for the safety of the residents and the safety of the community. The city, when they heard about this, came back and said, well, you don't qualify as a community resident, that you're really, now that it's turned into an institutional use, you need a special permit to do that. You're going to have to go through the application procedure and all of that procedure in order to qualify for a use permit, even though technically the community residence requirement in the village appeared to cover precisely what was going on in the home. I might mention that no one who was ill, no one who was having any respiratory problems or other problems were going to remain in the home after, once they were medically determined to have to move elsewhere. So this was simply a holding place for people who were being tested positive or came from homes where someone had tested positive. The federal judge issued a temporary restraining order saying that the existing zoning ordinance covered this home, and so the dispute here is a typical one in the land use regulation, is what provision of the zoning ordinance do you fit under? But up until now, the community residents had operated in the community without any substantial problems. So in addition to filing a suit in federal court, complaints have been filed with HUD, I understand, with the Illinois Department of Human Rights, and I think those are under investigation.
Thank you so much, Professor Seng. And Attorney Allen, as the professor said, I mean, most of us on the webinar are aware of your preeminence in the field of prosecuting fair housing matters and litigating such cases. Are there any cases out there under the Fair Housing Act in COVID-19 of which you're aware where there's actually been a decision handed down that might be of note to us, or that is percolating out across the United States that we might want to keep our eyes on?
Well, let me confess that I am talking to you from vacation. And so I have been literally out of the loop for the last week and a half. I'm not aware of a reported decision under the Fair Housing Act in the COVID context. I do know that under the ADA, there have been a number of decisions with respect to treatment, particularly in sort of emergency room circumstances and aftercare for people coming out of hospital settings. But I have to confess, I'm not aware of a fair housing case that is directly on point as yet. As you said, it's a fairly new phenomenon, and the cases simply haven't matured through the courts, at least to my knowledge.
All right, thank you very much. We'll keep our eyes out, though, and we'll probably be revisiting this for some time to come. If I could stay with you for a minute, though, Attorney Allen, as we said when we introduced this topic, in advance of this session, we had solicited FIPS, FAPS, IAOHRA members, and others on questions that they would like to have directed to you, our experts in this field. And I'd like to start with the first, if I may. And the question is, a local declaration of emergency relating to COVID-19 orders the closure of a communal swimming pool. There's a person with a disability, a leg amputee, who asks for the reasonable accommodation to this closure order and reasons that the swimming is an exercise compatible with their disability, and that as no other person is allowed to use the pool due to the local order, their use of the pool would not pose a threat of spread of COVID-19 to others. Do you believe the condo board can deny the request given the local order, or must they?
Well, it's a challenging question. So let me say first off, there is mention of threat in here, and I want to take off the table. There seems to be no consideration of the concept of direct threat under the Fair Housing Act, which of course would rob a person of a claim, even if it were a good disability claim. So we'll set that off to the side. It seems to me that the rule that has been imposed here is a rule that can be justified in terms of overall health, right? It's not the condo board's decision itself, it's the implementation of a local ordinance. Local government has parens patriae power over the health and safety of its residents and can certainly apply that kind of limitation in the context of places both public and private where people might congregate, in the same way that in Washington, D.C. until recently, there was a limitation on the number of people you could have congregate in your yard based on the concern about the spread of COVID. Given that it is a broad-based and not narrowly tailored requirement to close the pools, that it isn't targeted in any way at people with disabilities, I'd analyze the case as one in which it was a generally applicable rule, so subject to the reasonable accommodation claim, but as a practical matter, one that would likely impose an undue financial and administrative burden, that is to say, the condo association having to explain to local government why there's been a violation of the policy, or conceivably also a fundamental alteration of the underlying rule, which is presumably the condo association, as any housing provider would be, is subject to the generally applicable rules of the jurisdiction, and that asking to participate in that activity is essentially undermining the fundamental purpose of the rule in the first place. It may be that if that person is the only person there, that the threat of spread is dramatically limited. But I think you don't even get to that particular part of the analysis because it feels to me as if it is an accommodation, but perhaps not a reasonable accommodation as Fair Housing Act jurisprudence would define it.
Thank you, Attorney Allen. I know for the folks watching this webinar that we've received several comments or questions asking, will an outline of this be available later? They're just appreciating so much the knowledge being shared. And let me assure all watching that after this webinar is completed, it is being recorded. It will be hosted on IAOHRA's webpage, www.iaohra.org. So believe me, you will be able to go back and hear again this excellent information. But I'd like to turn to Director Nelson, if I may. We talked a little bit about this earlier, the concept or the phrase of the essential worker and how it's almost become ubiquitous over the last 6 months or so. Can a landlord reject an applicant, do you believe, because their employment is considered to be quote unquote essential? You know, the landlord perhaps fearing the applicant may become sick, may become unable to pay rent, or perhaps would spread COVID-19 to others in communities? Or conversely, can a landlord, do you believe, favor an applicant who works remotely, believing that they're more likely to maintain their employment, be able to pay rent, and not pose a risk of the threat of COVID to those in the community? Can you share what thoughts you might have on that?
Sure. So to preface that I am not an attorney, unlike the other gentlemen on this board. So none of my guidance today is legal advice. But in working through this particular question, I think it's important to just kind of take a step back. And a first question to ask is employment potentially protected under fair housing laws within your particular state or community? There are some parts of our country where there are protections based upon where somebody is employed, that they can't be discriminated against or denied housing just because of their place of employment, for instance. Now, most of the country does not have something like that, but for those areas that do, that's important to know, can't discriminate just because of where somebody lives. I think that's probably my opinion related to that. But let's assume you're in an area where there isn't that specifically outlined definition under fair housing law. So again, this is separate from any potential employment claims that might run, particularly if housing is provided with employment, related to that. I think that we venture into very dangerous territory when we start making these distinctions. It may not be unlawful potentially for somebody to do this, but we always need to think about, is there the potential that by having a policy like this, it is disproportionately impacting a group that's protected under fair housing laws? So let's say they said, we don't want to rent to any essential workers, and that includes nurses. And still in this country, nurses are overwhelmingly employed by women. And so then does that disproportionately then result in discrimination due to gender as part of that? And we could run on down the list related to that. So the attorneys may have other advice on it. I think it's dangerous practice, and it very well could violate fair housing laws, but it would depend upon the specific fact pattern.
Thank you, Director Nelson. You may not be an attorney, but that was some pretty sound guidance there. I will ask, however, if either of our co-panelists, Professor Seng or Attorney Allen, do you want to share any additional thoughts beyond what Director Nelson was kind enough to share?
I think Amy nailed it, but Michael, if you've got something, go ahead.
No, I agree completely. I defer to the non-attorney.
There you go, consensus. So I'm going to move along, Professor Seng. a person has moved to a new locale just as this pandemic has impacted the locality to which they've moved. When they first moved, not having a place to stay, they took as their residence an extended stay type of lodging. They since developed a disability-related need for a hospital bed, and they made a reasonable accommodation request to their hotel management. The hotel management denies that request, and they claim, look, we're a temporary lodging. We are not housing providers. This is not your residence. In this situation, might there be liability or at least a claim under the Fair Housing Act? And would the analysis change at all if the person with the disability isn't the one registered with the hotel, but is merely a guest of the person registered with the hotel?
Again, that's a difficult question, and in many ways, I would say it turns on the definition of a dwelling. And what is a dwelling under the Fair Housing Act, which is always with us regardless of whether we're dealing with a disability case or a case arising out of the pandemic or not. If it's temporary housing where somebody's going for a limited period of time, they're not really establishing a residence there. Residence is not used in the Fair Housing Act, but it's equivalent to a dwelling. Then it would be covered as a dwelling, or would not be covered as a dwelling. If it's somewhere where you're living indefinitely for that period of time, you're calling that home, you could make a decent argument, I think, that this is a dwelling and it is covered by the Fair Housing Act. Once you get it to be a dwelling, then you enter into the analysis that Michael articulated. Is this a reasonable accommodation that is necessary? And again, that would depend upon all the facts, but I think a lawyer probably could make a decent argument that a hotel bed, depending upon the disability, might well be required under the Fair Housing Act. But again, the question of expense, availability, all of those types of things are matters that would have to be worked out. Again, the question of a guest, generally guests are covered by the Fair Housing Act. But again, in this situation, if you'd have to give a reasonable accommodation to a guest, and you might have the question again, if it's temporary housing, whether you can even have a guest living in a place along with the tenant. I think those are all concerns, so I don't have a specific answer, but I think you'd have to look at all of those different concerns.
Thank you very much, Professor. So if I can turn back to Attorney Allen, a question we receive relates to condo associations. For those attending by webinar, no secret to anyone that the concept of masks and wearing masks is become contentious and heated throughout the United States. And the question is, there's a condo association in a 55 and older community holding a board meeting, and at the meeting, they're requiring all attendees to wear a mask due to a local statute or ordinance and consistent with CDC guidance. They have a resident, however, who insists that they have a disability-related reason why they cannot wear a mask, and further insists on attending the meeting in person, unmasked, to address the board. If the board exhausts alternatives to this resident's participation, in other words, they explore, can you appear by a video feed, by phone, by some alternative method, and the resident refuses those alternatives and insists on appearing in person, can the condo association preclude their attendance at the meeting?
So it feels like a law school exam, Paul. Thank you for posing it, or thank you for the person who posed it. And I guess I'd say the following. You know, it's a 55 and over community, not essential to the decision in this case, but we know that at a certain age, people become more susceptible to the impact of COVID. And so to the extent even if there were not a local statute or ordinance, if the condo association board had adopted such a rule to promote the health and safety of people, it seems that it would be something that would be well-grounded, shall we say. Now, it's also hard to imagine what the disability-related reason for not wearing a mask, for attending in person, and for addressing the board orally might be. But let's assume, in that law school exam sort of way, that that is in fact the facts that face us. The Fair Housing Act teaches that this is the kind of circumstance in which, again, reasonable accommodation is in play, provided that there is an underlying disability, and provided also that the accommodation requested is necessary to give this person an equal opportunity to enjoy, live in and enjoy the benefits of this particular housing community. And so I think we need to look carefully here to see, is the accommodation of coming unmasked in person and making an oral presentation what is necessary to give somebody an equal opportunity or not? Maybe, maybe not. I think in the end, the Fair Housing Act teaches, and the court decisions that have interpreted the reasonable accommodation provision teach, that a person making a request is entitled to an accommodation that would be effective, not necessarily to the accommodation of his or her choosing or design. And so sometimes when I do training, I say to people, you may ask for a Cadillac, but if a Dodge Dart is effective at getting what you need, then the Dart may be all that you're entitled to. This question embodies the whole idea of the interactive dialogue. So when an accommodation request is made, condo association is obligated to sort of take it on its own terms and to determine in the first instance, is this an undue burden? Would this constitute a fundamental alteration? I think in the first instance, the first step of the analysis, it could trigger either of those reasons to deny the accommodation as requested. And then if it went through the alternatives, as your hypothetical poses, and it was determined or that those alternatives were sort of turned down by the person who made the initial request, it feels to me like the interactive process is operated the way it's supposed to. It has not resulted in an agreed outcome. And at that point, if I were advising the condo association, something that I have tried to spend the last 35 years of my law practice not doing, my advice would be, you fulfilled your obligation under the Fair Housing Act. You need not grant this particular accommodation, so long as you articulate in the public health reasons for doing it, why you have turned this down, and recite that the other alternatives have at least been explored in the process. I think in many ways, documenting the steps and how they've been taken is the safest course for this condo board.
Thank you really for answering that. And that was the question as received. We didn't design it for bar passage, but we appreciate your taking up the cudgels nonetheless. But in addition to that comprehensive survey that you just gave in response, I would imagine that those same considerations, those same thoughts, because the question was in the context of a board meeting, but I would imagine it also would extend or apply if we were talking common areas such as a game room, a gymnasium, perhaps the swimming pool and deck. Would that be a correct thought?
Again, I think courts tell us that we've got to look at the facts of every case, but I would think that the basic principles, or at least frame of analysis that I laid out, would apply to all those others. It may be that there is a lesser impact if there are fewer people around, but I think generally that's a solid framework.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Now I'm going to turn to Director Nelson again, if I may, and pick up on a conversation we were having earlier about vulnerable communities, victims of sexual harassment, perhaps domestic violence. We all know as practitioners that these kinds of concerns are underreported. Can you help us understand and talk a little bit about why these kinds of cases are underreported? And if there are any particular aspects to the COVID pandemic which further exacerbate the problem such that whatever issues existed before an underreporting are only magnified in a pandemic situation?
Yeah, well, if you are worried as an individual about being able to, pay your rent and where you're going to go, you're not going to complain. And we see this quite often, particularly with individuals who are housing insecure and housing vulnerable within our communities, that they won't complain about the repairs. They won't complain about the harassment, whether that is by the housing provider or their neighbor or whatever it might be, because having the roof over their head may be what they feel that is what they can hold on to at that particular point. So COVID, as I kind of answered in our remarks earlier, has just really frayed and exasperated the problems that were already there. And I think hopefully one positive thing that maybe comes out of this is this broader discussion about housing really being the basis for so much in our lives. It's certainly been my opinion over recent years that housing has kind of not gotten the attention that it deserves. And we have seen a growing number of research reports about it, how everything unfortunately comes back to your zip code and where you live. And again, COVID has shown that, the likelihood to have high blood pressure rates or asthma is based upon your zip code. And COVID has shown how that having asthma and high blood pressure rates is going to increase your likelihood or not to recover from COVID. Related to that, we've seen the ability to access adequate health care, through this. Housing is health, and that's showing through. So at the very least, I hope that we will have the long overdue discussions about the importance of housing and address particularly some of these systemic barriers that have been persistent, that have not been acknowledged and addressed for decades, and start figuring out how we're going to counteract and overcome this, because we've just been kicking the can down the road for a few decades related to this. And housing needs to have its adequate attention. It needs to have adequate investment, including when it comes to fair housing enforcement. For my counterparts at FIPS and FAPS, if we had sufficient funds, if the Fair Housing Act was adequately funded in order to be able to do our work effectively, a lot more could have gotten done. And we need also robust policies and procedures. The attorneys on these panel have been doing groundbreaking court action. We need all of that working right now.
Thank you. Thank you for those thoughts. Would either of Professor Seng or Attorney Allen have any additional thoughts or comments they'd like to contribute?
I think Amy has done a wonderful job of summarizing it. And I really do think, I do like to look on the bright side of things, that we have a wonderful opportunity now to address many problems that are being exposed. The whole question of how housing ties into every other aspect of life is there. I received a call this morning involving a fair housing action that is being filed and environmental justice and those types of things. All of this is related, and I think if we can come out of this pandemic without a great deal of disturbance to those people who are renters, to those who are homeowners who are facing eviction, and can really concentrate on building up our neighborhoods, there'll at least be something bright that we can point to.
Thank you, Professor Seng. Attorney Allen, anything you'd like to share or add?
Nothing for me, thanks.
Very good. So we're kind of running out of time, and it's really the 50 minutes that we've been blessed with your knowledge and expertise has really flown by. We appreciate it. We're drawing up to the end of our session, so I do want to ask one capstone question. Later this afternoon, our last panel, we'll talk about COVID-19 as looked through, and the Fair Housing Act as seen through gender and racial equity lenses. Now, they're going to do a full treatment of that in that third session, but given your experience, the esteem in which all three of you are held, do you want to take a minute or two to talk about any thoughts you have about that before, set the table, as it were, for that last session? And I'll start in alphabetical order as we initiated these questions, and that would be you, Attorney Allen.
I'll just say very briefly, and others I'm sure have shared this view, which is we know that COVID-19 has affected communities of color dramatically more than white communities, and low-income communities of color in particular. That reflects both increased circumstances of underlying conditions, and that reflects a neglect both in housing quality and healthcare quality and access to both of those over many years. So I have every reason to believe that as we move toward having a vaccine, but while we're still kind of under this cloud, that the prospects of discrimination on the basis of race and of national origin are going to continue to plague people of color as they just seek basic stable housing and part of the American dream, whether in rental or in home ownership. And so I think we just need to gird for the secondary effects of this virus, which I think we'll live with for some time to come.
Thank you, Attorney Allen. And Director Nelson, any thoughts that you'd like to share to help set the table for that impactful third session we'll be having later today?
Well, I'm so happy that you're having it because everything is interconnected. I think that's probably been another issue that has been brought to attention, that these things are not in silos. Everything's interconnected, and I'm a housing advocate, so I feel housing is the basis of everything, but everything weaves in and out related to that and intersects. And there's so many of our policies and practices that we continue to see the harm in our neighborhoods still to this day. So counteracting that, addressing it, making proper investment is needed. And then I also encourage individuals in your own communities to also, give the housing message. And this isn't just the fair housing message, but a housing message about housing and its impact and how people can speak up and act, whether that's within their local city council, within their state general assembly, by visiting with their state representatives, or at the federal level, by reaching out, particularly at local and state levels. You're typically one of a much smaller constituent list by that elected official, and you truly can have an impact. And the only way we're going to get change is through people speaking up.
Thank you so much, Director Nelson. Professor Seng, any thoughts that you'd like to share?
Just one, and that is, don't think too legalistically about all of this stuff. Lawyers put everything in, and we've talked about it today. Is there disparate treatment? Is there a disparate impact? Can you meet the narrow categories and framework for proving those things? But we know that the effects of discrimination go way, way beyond what can be shown through the disparate treatment test, what can be shown through the disparate impact test. And when you're thinking of remedies, when you're thinking of things that need to be addressed legislatively, rulemaking, and agencies, again, have a lot of rulemaking power and things like that, think beyond, does it merely violate the law as defined by the disparate treatment test, by the disparate impact test, but is this a matter that really is impacting upon protected classes in the Fair Housing Act, and how do we remedy those disparities that have grown up over the years? I think that's really where we need, as policy making people, really where we need to put our attention. So don't think like lawyers.
Thank you so much, Professor Seng. And as I said, we really moved along quickly. It seemed like a breeze with the expertise and the experience shared by the three of my panelists today. I want to thank each of you, Attorney Allen, Director Nelson, Professor Seng, for making yourselves available to all of us today. I want to thank those members of the attendees to this webinar who provided the questions in advance. Thank you very much. I want to assure the attendees to today's webinar that, as I mentioned earlier, this is being recorded. This will be hosted on IAOHRA's webpage. You will have an opportunity to hear again this valuable information. And so if this were in a live setting, and hopefully we'll get back to the return to normal soon, I know there'd be a rousing round of applause for our three dynamic and impactful panelists. I thank you all. And it's now my pleasure and honor to introduce our next session. Session 2 is Best Agency Practices in the Age of Pandemic. And we're privileged to have as the moderator for that session, Melody Taylor, the HUD Regional Director and NAFTA's, the National Fair Housing Training Academy's Senior Advisor. Director Taylor, the webinar is now yours and your co-panelists.
Great. Thank you so much. I want to thank IAOHRA and President Toma for inviting HUD to the table to have this discussion about best practices. And I will not take time introducing my star-studded panel. That panel before us was a tough act to follow, but I think we will bring up a very strong second in our discussion on operating in a remote environment. So I'd like to turn to Jeffrey. Jeffrey, if you could tell us a little about yourself and introduce you and the agency that you work with.
I did it. I said I was going to do it. I actually started talking and had muted myself. So again, first and foremost, I want to thank President Robert Toma. I also want to thank the IAOHRA Conference Board. I also want to thank the Board of Directors, as well as Regional Director Taylor, as well as Director Peltier, as well as Assistant Secretary, for allowing us to be a part of this. Just quickly, a little bit about this, my organization that I'm with. I'm Jeffrey May with International Development and Planning, more commonly known as the Bowtie Guy. We are a for-profit technical assistance provider, consulting agency, planning firm. We provide support to local, state, and the federal government agencies all across the United States, specifically on fair housing issues and matters, but really kind of touching on all community development related as well as community investment related activities, projects. We work with, as I said, on the public side, but we also work with private clients as well. And again, we do this to just make this world a better place. And before I go much further, the last person I want to actually give a tremendous amount of gratitude to is Michael D. Mitchell, Esquire, my business partner, who actually does this wonderful work with me and actually leads our team. We also, lastly, are, and we want to thank you, Director Taylor, we are a part of the group of individual subject matter experts that are bringing back the National Fair Housing Training Academy. So we are working diligently with our colleagues, Mr. Tomkoviak and a host of others, obviously under the leadership of Director Taylor and Deputy Assistant Secretary David Enzel, to actually relaunch and bring that back. So we're working on the curricula, and we soon look forward to actually offering the training classes to all of you.
Great. Thank you for that shameless plug, Jeffrey. We appreciate it. Next on our panel is Akita Smith from DC Office of Human Rights. Akita, could you take a moment and tell us a little about yourself and your agency?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Melody. First of all, just like Jeffrey, I'd like to thank you all for inviting me to this panel. Again, Akita Smith Evans. I'm with the DC Office of Human Rights. I'm the enforcement manager overseeing intake and investigations. I've been with the DC Office of Human Rights for nearly 20 years, working in different capacities. So I'm happy to be a part of this discussion because we do a lot of teleworking, what some of us have. So just kind of speaking on the practices is a great idea.
Thank you, Akita. And last but not least, Mr. Tomkoviak, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Steve Tomkoviak, and thank you and good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to be a part of this panel, and I'm really enjoying the discussion we're having so far. For the last 2 years, I've been Executive Director of the Fair Housing Center in Metropolitan Detroit. I'm also working with Director Taylor as Senior Advisor to the National Fair Housing Training Academy. I'm kind of on the FIP side of it with Mr. Jeffrey May on the FAP side of it, but there's a whole number of people that are working. We would spend all afternoon thanking everybody. But anyways, I've done fair housing for now about 30 years, though I'm in a different capacity or wear a different hat doing the same work. And I look forward to continuing this important work during pandemic times and otherwise. Thank you.
Great. So if our tech person could advance our slides, that would be helpful.
Hold for
While
loading.
working on that, I just want to just kind of paint a picture. Since March of this year, many of us were asked to leave our jobs and or close our offices. Students and children found themselves being homeschooled by their working parents. A number of us are on conference calls, having interviews, and in the background we hear dogs and we hear children crying. And many Americans were left without jobs as a result of this great pandemic. In fact, it's been reported that some of the law firms representing respondents and or complainants in open investigations had to close their doors. And so a number of you I know have been met with many challenges in trying to figure out what's next, how do we move forward, what should our operations look like? And that's what our panel is going to share and discuss with you today. We immediately found ourselves having to adjust, acclimate, and determine ourselves to ensure continuity of services. However, for sure, we've had to quickly adjust, to rethink, retool, and prepare ourselves for remote interactions. Next slide, please. So today's session, we're going to seek to provide best practices to assist our FAP and our FIP human relations commissions and civil rights enforcement agencies to continue to operate their programs, serving their communities during this pandemic. But we'd first like to, next slide, please. We'd first like to ask a poll question. So in an effort to keep you engaged, I know this is going to be a long afternoon, and we decided we wanted to glean some hands-on data and information from our constituents during this webinar today. And so I want to ask a poll question. And if you would oblige us by responding to one or multiple questions, and after you select, hit the submit button, and it'll give us some good information or intelligence on where people are. So what changes has your organization made to adapt to investigating cases as a result of the pandemic? Have you purchased computers and cell phones or printers? I know that as Mr. Pelletier introduced during his remarks, the department has engaged in providing CARES Act funds so that there are opportunities to make purchases. Have any of you changed your policies regarding notarized statements or affidavits or sworn statements? Have there been any changes in how you allow for the electronic use of signatures? Have any of the agencies that are out there changed policies regarding how evidence is received and handled? Or if there are any other changes that you've made, we'd like to hear about it. So I'm going to give you maybe a minute or so to respond to the poll question so we can get a better handle on where folks are in this process. Okay. I don't see it. I don't see that anyone's responded as of yet. Angela, are you able to see any of the numbers from the poll questions as of yet?
Yes, currently we have 51% for purchased computers, cell phones, and printers, 35% for changed policies regarding notarized statements, 62% for allowing electronic signatures, 39% said they changed policies regarding how evidence is received and handled, and 47% said other changes. When you're ready, I can end the poll.
Okay, I think we have a good understanding of where our communities are. It looks like a number of you have definitely upgraded your systems, and many of you have already adapted or changed to electronic mediums for signatures. It's good to know that this has already transpired. A number of agencies were already in a place of moving into an electronic environment, and so some of this was seamless for many agencies, but with some of the smaller agencies that did not have access to technologies, et cetera, moving into this remote environment has presented a challenge, to say the least. So we want to just go into a discussion with our panel. And I'm going to ask Jeffrey if he could kick us off. Jeffrey has a very unique background and opportunities. As he described, he has engaged in training FAPs and FIPS around the country. And so he has been able to give us really good intelligence on some of the best practices that he's seeing in working with some of the FIPS and FAP agencies around the country. So one of the questions that was posed to us is, what are a few remote platforms that would assist FAP and FIP agencies with conducting intakes and or interviews? And Jeffrey, I'm going to ask you if you could really drill down on the process and keep that in perspective. What happens, or what are some of the tools that can be used as one is conducting an intake? We're in a remote environment. You have a complainant that needs to be interviewed. They want to submit documentation. So what are some of the remote platforms that can be used in that regard? And then also from a practitioner's perspective, someone who's having to conduct an interview, a respondent now, the respondent's attorney, their doors have closed. You have an open investigation. What are some of the tips and techniques that you could provide as an example to our FAPs and FIPS? And you may be on.
I did it again. Thank you, Director Taylor, for that question. So first and foremost, the Human Relations Commissions, Human Rights Commissions, the FIPS and the FAPs that I've been fortunate to actually be working with across the country, as we've actually been assisting you with your work to improve the services that you're providing your respective jurisdictions, as we've been providing technical assistance, training you. I want to make it clear, we also feel this is a reciprocal process. We learn from you as we've actually been doing this work. So I need to give credit to many of the Human Relations, Human Rights Commissions, the FIPS and the FAPs that have actually, we work with as clients and provide technical assistance to. That being said, my remarks, and I want to give a special commendation specifically to the state of California's Department of Employment and Fair Housing, Director Kevin Kish, and also Maria Gonzalez, because a number of and for that matter, Texas Workforce, Brian Snoddy, and also Patrick Williams, because a lot of the things that I'm sharing with you and going to share with you are kind of reflections of your great work that you've been doing. So first and foremost, before I get deep into the best practices part, I want everyone to be mindful of this. We're making these technological advances, and data's my friend. That's a mantra that many of you have actually heard me say in the trainings that we actually provide, and it is. Technology is our friend. However, we need to make sure that we are cognizant of, and not just our agencies, but many of the agencies as I've trained you all touch the Housing Community Development Department. You touch the Planning Department. You're touching the Health Department, and a lot of other departments that actually have a fair housing obligation, or kind of their responsibilities merge into those responsibilities to serve the same protected classes that you all have and your local jurisdiction, as well as under the federal law. So what's the crux of this is what I want to say is, we have made these technical advances and these leaps. Some of us have been doing this for years in the state of California, for example, in terms of the Department of Employment and Fair Housing. However, our clients have not. We're dealing with, we see right now, Director Amy Nelson remarked about it in terms of the pandemic has really kind of exposed the disparities that exist on the basis of the protected classes that we diligently work to support and protect. So we've made that leap, but the digital divide is real. So that means that we are in a position to utilize the technology that I'm going to talk about in a moment, but I really want to impress upon all of us that we need to still employ, as the handbook, Title 8 handbook has pondered, low-tech ways to engage those parties, the aggrieved parties, complainants, as well as respondents. And let us make sure that these technological best practices that I'm going to remark about and that are going to be talked about by the other co-panelists, that is not a barrier. We need to make sure that's not a barrier to people being able to actually have their fair housing rights protected, because we don't want to put things in place that are going to discourage and in some instances put these aggrieved persons in a place that they just simply give up, especially in a time that they really have a lot of needs and we should be there vigilantly to assist them. So with that, I just want to add that disclaimer. With that, could you please advance to the next slide? So the question is, what platforms do I suggest or recommend? Well, one of them that we're on right now is actually Zoom. That's one of our favorite ones to utilize. There are a number of platforms that many of you have. I'm fortunate that my firm, we have a proprietary platform, video conferencing platform that we work with. So Skype, Zoom, Teams, WebEx, obviously all of those are suitable and appropriate video conferencing platforms, and team management platforms and software as well. And the reason I want to make kind of just underscore the team management, obviously we need to be utilizing this to conduct our intakes, conduct our interviews of the complainants, of the respondents, of their witnesses, of the complainant and respondents as well. In the course of our investigations, use them in conciliations. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But it's also something that we need to use internally. That's a way in which we can keep our staff engaged even though they're working remotely. So being able to manage, stay in communication, making sure that you're connecting with your team and making sure that the work is moving forward. Obviously, those of us who are on the FAP side have the statutory, you may have your statute of limitations and you have your prescription that you have to work underneath in terms of your 100 days and conduct your investigation. But whether you're Human Relations, Human Rights Commission, or FIP or FAP, being able to use these video conferencing platforms to engage the parties that we're here to serve is obviously essential. Many of you said that you're doing this already. I do want to point out in terms of, it's also something that really helps, it's helpful in terms of your team management. Lastly, before I move to the next slide, is dealing with conciliations. You need to also utilize this in such a way, the same way that we were doing this on the telephone and also utilizing emails. It may be appropriate to have, as we have here in this wonderful forum, to have all of the parties present so that everyone can see each other, using it to be able to read body language, using it to be able to assess where people are with things so that they can see you and you in turn can see them. But it's also, you also need to be mindful of the fact that, hey, we are dealing with very, very sensitive matters when we're talking about investigating housing discrimination, sexual harassment, as we spoke about, domestic violence issue, which these things are, unfortunately, we anticipate that they are on the rise. You may find that these forums are not the best way to kind of convene that. We may need to keep those parties separate to make sure that we're not doing anything that's going to do harm or traumatize or injure any of those persons. So again, I want to encourage that you all utilize the technology, but please be very sensitive to the opportunities and potentially pitfalls that actually exist within them. Move on to the next slide, please.
And Jeffrey, before you move on, I think I'd like to add, as you spoke about the digital divide and the notion that there are many who do have the use of technology, so too are those who don't. And yes. There's nothing like a good old phone. No. And making sure that we're, in our intakes, we're picking up the phone, we're calling people, we're connecting to them by use of the phone. There are many who may not have access to a computer. And if you're dealing with an eviction situation, they may not have access to the internet. And so the notion that you, as an intake analyst or practitioner, should first just pick up the phone and make sure that whatever technologies that you are embarking upon or you're going to use, that your complainant or your client has a good understanding of the use of the technologies that you have. It's important for you to know the technology that you're using as well. In Teams and in Zoom and other platforms, it allows for breakout rooms. So let's, for example, you're conciliating a case and there's a need to have consensus discussions. Those are things that as an investigator, you'll need to plan out in advance.
Yes.
Look to your IT folks on your teams to help you understand the software and the systems that you're using so that you could fully utilize them to best serve you as you're working through some of these circumstances and scenarios.
Absolutely.
So with that being said, just a number of our HUD staff internally, FAPS and FIPS are absolutely continuing to do relevant work, relevant fair housing work in this remote environment. As we're filing complaints and conducting investigations, and as we just talked about, conciliating. Jeffrey, could you go into greater detail about some of those best practices in managing files and documents? So we move from, gleaning information from a complainant, actually getting electronic complaint filed, notification letters have now gone out to the parties, and we're now knee-deep in conducting an investigation. And we have to get documents from a respondent, position statements. Can you talk a little bit about what that might look like in terms of managing the files and documentation and strategies that one should employ?
Yes, ma'am. Next slide, please, because I want to kind of say a few things about this point. First, before I even speak about the use of electronic signatures, I do want to pick up on something and underscore something that Director Taylor said, and I even want to kind of peel that back a bit further. So as these complaints come in, as you're getting the signatures, you're getting signatures on your complaint forms, you're getting signatures, or you're getting, you're in the place in which you're getting statements signed, you're moving down the road to attempting conciliation, because as we know, conciliation attempts are supposed to be done throughout the entire process. We need to please be aware that that digital divide is real. So we need to pick up the phone and call people to affirm, okay, I have this information, we've sent this information, we've sent out an interrogatory request, we've actually sent out to you various information that, let's say it's a settlement, a proposed settlement that's being discussed. You want to call that person and ask them whether or not they received it. I'm often, there are a lot of mantras that I like, and this is one that I feel like it's important to say to everyone. If you fail to plan, then plan to fail. I'm gonna say it again. If you fail to plan, then plan to fail. So that means that when you are putting together your investigative plan and your preliminary investigation and you're beginning, you may have already sent out your notification letters. You're sending them out stamped mail still. You're still sending them out certified mail as well, and you're anticipating getting receipt of that. You want to affirm that. Call them, and not only call them when you're in your intake initially, and also when the case is transferred to the investigator. Make sure that you not only have a good contact information. I would suggest having two contact information, 2 points of contact for the aggrieved person and the complainant. So someone that can actually that you can leave messages for, that you can communicate or converse with if you're unable to speak with the complainant. Often, I mean, that can be the same case for the respondent as well. But I want to urge you to plan for that. Put that in as a part of your preliminary investigation. Put that as a part of your investigative plan, so that it isn't something that you've now find yourself that you're in a position that you need to get the document signed. You sent it to them via their email, and you're in a place that you are unable to move forward, and you aren't able to stay within and conduct investigations within your 100 days, because that was something that you actually failed to plan for. we're sharing with you, making sure that you actually communicate that and plan for that so that you have 2 points of contact. That's going to be the case for all of our aggrieved persons and complainants. But I want to say especially for those who are in a position and their immigration status may be tenuous. They are very, very vulnerable right now, and all of the aggrieved persons and complainants, their housing situation may be quite tenuous. So being able to have a reliable place in which they're receiving their mail, and you may get a return that the return document that the certified mail didn't go through. I don't want you to rest on your laurels and say, well, I've sent the DocuSign to them. I've sent the Adobe Sign or Echo signature for them, or Sign Now. These are really good platforms that you see that are up here on the presentation. We want to encourage you to use that. There are layers of security that you can actually use to affirm whether or not those documents have been opened up. You can actually send passwords to make sure that this is actually happening, that you're reaching the appropriate person. That needs to still happen. But please, again, to underscore the point that Director Taylor meant, which is you need to supplement that. You need to actually make the phone call. You need to make sure they're using stamp mail. You need to make sure they're using certified mail in order to as a handbook has pondered. But you need to make sure you're doing that. Lastly, in terms of the using electronic signatures, which is a wonderful use of being able to get signatures in a remote environment, I need to point out that Maria Gonzalez and also Director Kevin Kish, they've been doing this for about 4 years now because of the sheer size. And again, as I remarked about a moment ago, Director Brian Snoddy and also Patrick Williams from the Texas Workforce Commission, just by the sheer size of their jurisdiction, they've had to actually utilize these approaches and these best practices. But again, I want to kind of underscore, you need to make sure that you are narrowly tailoring your requests, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment when we talk about the scanning of documents. But again, make sure that this is not a barrier. Make sure that this is not a barrier to people being able to actually do this wonderful work. So with that, can I please have the next slide? And this is my next slide and last slide. I'm going to encourage everyone to utilize, now we're in a place that you're collecting evidence is coming into you. You're going to need to make sure that you have a repository to do that. Just as I remarked about earlier, some of your colleagues are doing this. California has been doing this for quite some time already. They have a designated repository in which all evidence and information that's collected from the complainants, respondents, and their witnesses are going and moving to that particular place. You're going to need to do something similar. I know there's been an investment in scanning and computer equipment that you're going to use so that you're working at home, but you need to make sure that you have a way in which no one should be actually having evidence come directly from parties to their home. There's a lot of risk of security matters that surround that, but you don't want to be in a place that you are breaching chain of custody because a document has been compromised and you don't have set protocols to have that happen. So in closing, I'm going to encourage all of you to use these technologies in concert with each other. Data is your friend and so is technology, but please let's remember that we're here to serve our communities, and they may not have the same access to the same technologies that you do. And with that, that's the end of my remarks.
Great, thank you, Jeffrey. And as you were speaking, we were getting a few other questions that came in. So at the end of the presentation, we're attempted to allow for a few more minutes for us to respond to some of the questions. I'm going to quickly pivot to FAP operational assessments during the pandemic. As I mentioned to you before, we have Akita Evans, who's on the webinar with us today. And DC Office of Human Rights is uniquely situated. They have over approximately 18 or 19 protected classes, and DC OHR sits in my region. And one of the things I quickly sought to do was to assess the operations of our FAP agencies and our FIP agencies to determine what the needs are. Could we, how could continuity of services continue? What were some of the things that we could do and think through innovatively, collectively, so that our persons who believe that they've been discriminated against could continue to receive services? So without further ado, I'm gonna ask one more poll question quickly. And if you're able to respond in the next 30 seconds, please do so in the vein of keeping you engaged. One of the questions the question we like to ask is, have you seen an increase in complaints from certain protected classes due to COVID-19? In the first panel, you heard Michael Allen and Ms. Nelson and others talk about the increase in certain types of complaints. So we want to just kind of glean from the audience, have you seen an uptick in complaints? And we really want to know how you're dealing with it. So if you've seen an increase in race cases, national origin cases, we know that there are disparities in communities of color as it relates to evictions. And so we're seeing some uptick there in disability claims. Just on a national level, 65 to 70% of complaints that come in our offices relate to disability currently. That was prior to COVID-19. But are you seeing any nuanced disability complaints that are coming in? And then families with children. Now that children are at home during the day and are in apartment complexes and places of that nature, are we seeing an increase in the denial of persons who have children who are seeking rental situations and others? So we just like to get a glean on that information from you guys. And again, we could give just some data or intelligence on that in the next 15 to 20 seconds. I want to quickly go into assessing operations.
When you're ready, let me know when you want to end polling.
If you've gotten any data, I'll take your results and then I'll move quickly into Akita's presentation, please. Great. So 20% have seen an increase in race cases, 9 in national origin. As I suspected, disability, again, prior to the pandemic, we had seen a large rise in that number of complaints or those types of complaints. And it looks like we're seeing a higher number there now as well. And then with families with children also. So good to know and important information for you to assess as you're thinking about what kind of education you need to get out to your clients during this time. You may have to pivot to a different education outreach platform, which is really important and things that we wanted to stimulate some thinking about as we're looking at assessing our operations. So with that being said, I'm going to turn to Akita, and if you could talk a little bit about what the DC Office of Human Rights did, what were some of the things or considerations that were made, and how did your agency ensure the continuity of services were being carried out?
Thank you, Melody. Absolutely. And just we're now up to 21 protected traits. Although some of those don't apply to housing, and it's mostly been some things added for employment. So like you said, DC is a broad and unique sort of spectrum. So one of the things that the Office of Human Rights did, if I can get the next slide, please, is first we made an assessment and met with the management team as well as some of the team members to determine evaluating our services that were currently offered. So anything from intake to mediation to investigation, we pretty much jotted all of that out and talked that through to determine if we could still continue those services remotely. One of the first parts is what services we could still provide. And then the second part was more of a communication strategy is how we can get that information out to the public. Another part that we also assess is what is the needs of the staff in order to perform their duties remotely. And a lot of the things that Jeffrey spoke about is some things that we had already implemented, or we upgraded our services as far as DocuSign and those type of things. Next slide, please. So the first part with our operational updates, we decided to adjust our services by conducting all telephone intakes and interviews, from witness interviews to investigative interviews. We suspended the in-person interviews. We also started accepting complaints electronically with the electronic signatures. Another action that we took was to waive notarization requirements, because under our statute, all complaints have to be signed and notarized. So in DC, we envisioned that there would be a shelter in place. And once we discovered that, our legal team expeditiously went to work to start writing and amending our regulations to get notarization requirements changed, in which they did a drafting of that. They then sent it to the Office of the Attorney General and to other executive reviews to have that supported. Once that was approved, our legal team published that in the DC Register, and that process took about 7 days, as it was considered emergency ruling, because as most of you may know, certain statutes, it takes months to get them changed, or maybe even years in some jurisdictions. Some of the other things that we did as far as investigations and as well as an intake is we granted extensions beyond the normal time frame, but still kept it reasonable, because we know we have to investigate housing complaints in a certain amount of time. So we took those steps, and we published all of this information on our website, and we did email blasts so the community would know that we were still operating virtually and that we weren't closed, but we were still providing services. The second part that we looked into is the resources needed. So what did our staff need? What did our team need? And as Jeffrey mentioned, you know, having that technology and having the different platforms. We utilize Microsoft Teams, WebEx for meetings and for interviews. We provided equipment to our staff and laptops and VPN service. We also made sure that we had IT available to assist persons from home, where they can remote in virtually from wherever they are to help the person if they need some sort of setup with their computer or laptop. And then we also made sure that we utilize a case management system to move the cases electronically without having the physical file. So all of the information was uploaded, scanned into our system. Anything that came in for intake, it was put into the system. We also utilize a shared drive. So all of the team members have access to a shared drive where it's not shared externally, but you can keep the security using a shared drive. And we would put information on there, we put updates on there, and we would store case files electronically on there if needed. Some of the other things that we offered was just making sure that we kind of understood, as Melody had mentioned earlier, what if someone doesn't have a computer and they have to just communicate via telephone? So we had to get basically creative for maybe some of the elderly community or someone who's not used to technology. We would get phone calls and we'll walk them through. A lot of people these days have smartphones, so they are able to at least maybe take a picture of something and send it back. So sometimes we got flexible in those ways if they couldn't comply to the platforms that we were offering. We also made sure that we kept our connections with vendors to assist us if we needed ASL or some oral interpretation services. So our language access program really did a great job with that, making sure we were still in connection with our vendor. And if that vendor couldn't provide the service, they referred us to a service that was available during the time of the pandemic or even now.
Next slide, please.
So I just wanted to talk a little bit about some tips to help your team remain productive, collaborative, and working while they're at home. Creating a routine that helps to just keep you into a mental state where you can just focus on the work, and establishing a routine puts you in the mindset that you can focus and be efficient. Because I know many times we've had some of us teleworked, but not all of our staff did. So we just had to kind of get them in a mindset to know how to do it from home, because some people didn't feel disciplined enough to do it. So just setting a routine as you would normally do when you come to work, creating task reminders, and just kind of staying with that so you can just have a working knowledge while you're still at home. Also setting boundaries, because although we love our family members or our children, they will come and they would interact with you when you're trying to conduct your business or work. So sometimes you just have to let people know, hey, these are my working hours. I'll talk to you at 4 o'clock. Oftentimes I know I had to do that with my children. Removing online distractions is another tip. because even though we are at home, we still are working and providing services to the public. So you don't want to get caught up with looking at Twitter or Facebook. Use that, you know, during your break times. And then the next thing, as Jeffrey had often mentioned in his presentation, is making sure you have the right equipment. Making sure your team has the right equipment, making sure the staff has the right equipment, whether it's the laptop, whether it's cell phones, because one of the things that we did, we also offer cell phones to our receptionists who still continue to answer the phone as if we were actually in the building. So that was a great help. He could direct the calls to, you know, all of the staff. And then lastly, creating your own workspace. And there was times when I would work from home and I would sit in the bed with my laptop, and I found that that wasn't a great thing, that I needed to actually designate a workspace, or get organized, lay all the information out so that I could be productive with my team. And so far, that's what I've done here, is created a space which has allowed me to still conduct business as usual. It allowed me to still meet with my team virtually, and also to pass on information as necessary. And it made me more creative in how I thought about things and how we could process things. So I would just say the bottom line is just basically to be flexible and creative. And just remember, it's up to you to make it a productive experience. It doesn't have to be as difficult as some may, you know, believe.
Great. Thank you, Akita. So we're slowly running out of time, and I want to segue into Steve's presentation. So our FIP partners provide a critical role in being able to reach our clients in places where federal and state and local governments are unable to do so. So we've asked Steve to share best practices from the FIP perspective. So I'm not going to take a lot of time, Steve. I want you to go right into your presentation, please. Thank you. Next slide.
All right, I'm going to address three real quick points. First, the effect of COVID on FIP complaint intake, investigation, and testing. Second, available technology to enable FIPs to seamlessly work remote. And third, more broadly, steps FIPs should take to prepare for pandemics and other emergency situations to avoid disruption of operations. First part is, what impact has there been on FIP's core fair housing activities? As a complaint intake, it's been limited, since most complaints come through telephone calls, emails, and our website. That's probably, I think, is true generally for most FIPs. However, there has been an increase in housing-related inquiries. Much of these have to do with questions about moratoriums, people facing threat of evictions without being unable to seek or view or obtain alternative housing. There's been a greater impact as to fair housing investigations. You could say there's a technology gap among complainants. Well, the gap is always there. It's just in times like this, the gap is exposed for what it is. And it's twofold, really. Some do not have the technology. Some have the technology but don't know how to use it. In other kinds of situations, you can have a third party gather documents or scan and send emails, things of that nature. But in a pandemic situation, people are reluctant to associate, they're kind of self-quarantining or keeping social distance. So that's a concern. We can't go out to someone's home and pick up records like we would normally do. Others, can't walk the documents into the office. So it's been a problem there. There's been some delay in what we've done from an investigation standpoint because of that. There's no impact as to, for example, doing online investigations. That kind of information is still available. There is, on doing an on-site, again, that would be a problem because you can't have that face-to-face interaction. In terms of testing, there's been little impact on telephone tests. It's been effective for some issues, not as much for others. For example, you can request reasonable accommodation or modifications over the phone, but as to other kinds of testing like race testing, it's a little bit more difficult. We need to really explore, telephone testing with voice recognition as well. However, there are other kinds of tests which get at race, for example, that can be still, and we are success doing testing on that. For example, testers can call and ask about housing providers' policy concerning felony records. And we've had many tests showing differences in treatment when it comes to that. And another example, kind of surprising, we received a complaint, someone was turned down because they had a Detroit voucher and it was not accepted outside Detroit. So we've done telephone tests where a number of housing providers, not in the, basically in the area outlying Detroit, will accept vouchers, but not Detroit vouchers. Approximately, our percentage is 97.4% of Detroit voucher holders are Black. There's also, we've had testers told over the phone that a strict 2-person per bedroom limit applies with no consideration of the factors listed in the Keating memorandum. But again, amazingly, a majority of our complaint-based and systemic tests right now show evidence of discrimination. So it's well over 50% both ways. On-site testing is a problem. Some housing providers still do not permit on-site visits. Others offer virtual tours. However, testers will not be seen during the virtual tours. Some are doing FaceTime and Zoom. A limited number will allow properties to be visited using social distancing techniques. I have an example on the slide, leaving apartment key on the table, and the tester comes in, puts their ID down, takes the key, views the unit, then brings the key back. But in terms of, last part, in terms of enforcement, we haven't had a difficulty filing HUD, FAP, court complaints. The main concerns have been delays in investigation of the complaints and movement of court cases. There's been some movement with courts, but that's not something that we can control. As they're able to, courts will move forward with cases. We could please move to the next slide. Kind of more broadly is using cloud-based technology to work seamlessly. FIPS have smaller staff, probably about 4 or 5 to 7 or 8 staff members, so it's easier for them to implement technology updates. We use with success Microsoft Office for nonprofits. It's a business basic special nonprofit rate, $3 per user per month or $36 per year, 1 free terabyte of cloud storage. It's access to SharePoint file storage system. It gives you the full range of Office applications. And these are not just the apps that are online, those are the apps, the full desktop apps. You're allowed to have all those stored on, loaded up on 5 devices, desktop, laptops, handheld. So it's really a broad range. It assists in electronic storing information. One thing we use Outlook where we can drag mail items right into the folder. So it's really, that's an enormous benefit. If you send an email to a complainant or a respondent, you drag the mail item over and you have it in there. The mail item goes in there with the attachment and you just open it up. It opens up an Outlook and you have the whole document. You can also email the email, if that makes sense. The cloud-based file storage system, we use SharePoint. It's like the equivalent of Dropbox, Microsoft's equivalent of it. All files and records are scanned and put into, stored into complaint files on it. It's accessible in any kind of remote location. Our database is cloud-based as well. We use there's Miami Valley Housing Center. It's a one-time fee. DiversaLink has an annual fee. By way of application, test coordinator can assign tests through those cloud-based database, receive them, enter the results into the database, drag the test results into SharePoint files or upload them into the database. It's a real efficient system. It works well in reporting out in terms of enforcement law. It's an enormous time saver and it's a fast turnaround on testing and test results. We've done it where we've done get a complaint on Friday and it's tested Monday. I find out about it on Monday and it's already been tested. In terms of telephone system, we have a voice over IP frontage for business. It's $40 a month per user. The phones are free. The neat feature is a simultaneous ring. You can set it up. Everyone's extension will ring to their cell phone. We can have an extension ring to multiple cell phones. So basically you're picking up the call live, so no one has to be, they don't even know if you're in the office or out of the office. It's the same function as though we're in the office. Calls are returned with the Vonage business app as though with the same caller ID from the office. We have voice, and if you want to answer your phone 24/7, your office phone, you're free to do something, but the option is there. Voicemail is sent to, voicemail messages are sent to email. We can basically email messages or email voicemail message. Oh, I need you, hey, please return this call. Could you do it for me? And we can email it to another person. We also have a virtual fax system where the faxes are sent directly from our computer as an email attachment, and faxes come in, they come right in to the email, it comes right into Outlook, and you just drag the fax over into the file. An intake officer specialist could work remote just like they were in the office. One last part is what are the best practices for working remote? If we move to the next slide, thank you.
In the next slide.
Yeah, and several. right? If we go to the next slide, the recommendations that I would say, first, there has to be a continuity of operations plan or COOP plan, prepare for the crisis. It's required for federal agencies, probably state agencies as well, but there's essential elements that you have to have, lists of essential functions. What are the essential functions of your office? What are less important that you can defer until things have stabilized? Order of succession, if the director or someone is not available, the test coordinator is not available, who's going to step in? Delegating authority, relationship between the board and staff or director. Continuity of facilities, where's that going to be? Continuity of communications that occur. And records management as well. The point, though, is that many of the suggestions that made in the previous slide about upgrading your technology answers a lot of these questions. We're not concerned about our documents or a fire destroying all our documents because they're cloud-based. And then we have backup systems in place with the files that are stored cloud-based. So there's multiple layers of protections in that. A question that came in, HUD GTR says we can't use costs for equipment purchase as part of our grant cost. We purchase all the technology. I'm looking at 2 refurbished monitors. I have a refurbished computer and you wouldn't know the difference. I'll buy open box items. So it's very low cost. I don't know what the implications would be. I suspect if you use HUD funds to purchase the equipment would be HUD, or it'd have to be 100% designated for use on HUD work, which I don't think you really want to commit to. So we just avoid all that in terms of equipment purchase on the grant application and the budget. We just don't get into it. Do not list equipment on that. Do it out of your general funds, or it may be an opportunity for people to contribute to your office. Another thing, along with the COOP plans, they're available online. A great example, Connecticut Fair Housing Center has an emergency operations procedure. They did it in March 2020. That's a great sample. If you email me or contact IAOHRA, we'll get that to you. Some of them have pandemic-specific COOPs, but I don't think you really want that. I think you want that's more general to address any kind of emergency situation. And keep it real practical. Update your policy manual, review the bylaws, so that you address those kinds of things. You can have it automatic, like you have to call the director to see if the office is going to be closed. We have a standard practice. I mean, they may send a text, hey, can we work remote today? You know, we may have a snow day or something like that. And all I do is say yes. Or you could tie it to a local school district. If the school district has a snow day, you've got a snow day. Or if there's maybe a government that you'd want to use. So you don't have to make that call. If someone's not available, that way everybody makes sure the word gets out to everybody that you're going to work remote. But we transitioned immediately to remote like it's no problem. Someone early just this week had to have work done at his home. And so what he did is, hey, can I work remote? He worked that morning till the repair person came and able to have an effective work day as though he was in the office because everything is cloud-based. And then last thing, carefully draft your statement of works to keep in mind unforeseen circumstances. HUD will work with you. They issued a statement that they'll work with you, revise your statement of work as needed. But really, look for issues. I mean, I can say we're doing fine and we're going great, but the reality of it is everybody is having to do some workarounds because of the pandemic. I'd like to close with a real short little story, like 30 seconds. My wife and I, my son broke up with his girlfriend. We asked, why did you do it? And he said, well, she wasn't in it for the long haul. Whatever that meant, I don't think he wanted to explain what was going on. But the reality of it is, in terms of COVID, we are all in it for the long haul. Whether we like it or not, we need to embrace it. Whatever, if it's a new reality or a temporary reality, it doesn't matter. But take this as an opportunity to revisit what you're doing, how you go about it, and make improvements. Take a problem and turn it into an opportunity. As like Joe Peltier said, to continue to provide thorough and professional complaint intakes and investigations. That's our goal. Thank you.
I couldn't have closed out better, Steve. And in the absence of time, I'm going to use your statement for the closure. I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank everyone for staying engaged over these last 50 minutes. I am now behind time by 3 minutes, so I want to go ahead and pivot to our next panel and turn it over to Jean Kelleher from Alexandria Office of Human Rights. And they're going to have a robust, engaging panel on the inequities that we're seeing during this COVID and pandemic time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Director Taylor.
Okay, I have unmuted myself and I want to wait until I see my panel. Okay, welcome everyone. Wonderful to see all of you. I'm Jean Kelleher. Thank you so much, Melody. I'm the director of the Alexandria Office of Human Rights in the city of Alexandria, Virginia, and immediate past president of IAOHRA. And I'm very, very pleased to welcome you and thank you for staying with us for this third session entitled Fair Housing and COVID-19, as seen through race and gender equity lenses. I'm so pleased to present three panelists who are experts in fair housing. And as we have said before, we're keeping the bios brief because we're going to be posting bios and photos on the website along with the recording. With us, we have Stella Adams of S.J. Adams Consulting. She is the former Chief of Equity and Inclusion at the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. And Lisa Rice, President and CEO of the National Fair Housing Alliance. And third, we have Megan White de Vasquez, trial attorney at DOJ, and she is coordinator of the Department of Justice's Sexual Harassment in Housing Initiative. Welcome to all of you. And for our attendees, what we have done is framed three broad questions with the input of the IAOHRA board and specifically our regional representatives based on information that they have gleaned from our members. So I will start initially with Stella Adams, and I know Stella has some slides that she's going to share. She'll share her screen with us, but I'd like to pose the first question to Stella. What have been the effects of the double pandemic of COVID-19 and racism on gender and racial equity in fair housing?
Thank you, Jean, for inviting me. Let me know, can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm going to talk really on a high level and quickly about what the inequities are. What the COVID-19 has done has actually been to exacerbate and expose the true race and gender equity issues that have been facing our communities, but have just been made worse by this environment. Professor Seng spoke earlier about the book Evicted, which again highlighted some of the inequities faced by African American women in the rental market. I'm going to leave to my esteemed panelists behind me to talk in more detail around what we're seeing in terms of actuation of fair housing issues. So the first thing I want to kind of point out is that it's the economics of how people are losing jobs and losing assets that then impact their housing availability, which is why the moratoriums have been so important. Well, we're aware that there are 16 million people unemployed at this time. The losses that we've seen in small businesses, which small businesses in America create the majority of jobs. And so when many of those jobs are from the service industry, which is restaurants and other kinds of small businesses that have shuttered their doors and have done them and have lost their way. And you say, Stella, but what about PPP? Wasn't that to save these small businesses? And the answer is, yes, it was. But discrimination reared its ugly head in that arena. In fact, the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, in a study they released in July of this year, July 15th of this year, they did phone testing on PPP. So this is not generalized small business lending. This is the PPP. And they asked the question, and one of the results were, did they tell you you would qualify for PPP? And for white males, 32% of the time they were told they qualified. Black males were told 8% of the time. White females were told 3.4% of the time. And Black females were told 0, with a Z-E-R-O, were they told they qualified for PPP. This is discrimination. This is not an inequity because, oh, they work too many jobs or the type of jobs they work, or this is straight up, no chaser, discrimination. And it has real consequences for women, as you can see. If you look at these, Black males were denied access 4 times as often as white males, 10 times as often for white females, and Black females were denied 100% of the time. This is discrimination, but what does that translate to? It means, and these are real numbers from the New York Fed, and this data came out on Monday. 41% decline in the number of Black-owned businesses across the nation. Lost, gone forever, 41%. 32% decline in Latinx-owned businesses. 26% decline in Asian-owned businesses. 17% decline in white-owned businesses, and the majority of those, according to Vanguard, 40% of those were from white women. And so this is the result of, this is what this translates into in terms of loss of employment, loss of businesses, loss of income. And this is something that we as FIP and FAP organizations through testing can address. Women are working at home. And as a speaker on our last panelist discussed, right? When we're at home, it doesn't actually translate. Even if your husband is at home and you're both working from at home, the children don't go bother daddy. They go and bother mom. And then what we have seen, we've seen reports of women who lost their jobs because their children were too loud in the background. And the bosses, these are reported cases where women lost their jobs at home, working remotely at home, because they couldn't keep the babies quiet. And that was a problem for their owners. And then this translates then to housing issues and housing insecurity. So now we have, we're at home, we have income struggles, women are bearing the brunt of this. Again, this is double, triple, quadruple impact on Black women. 70% of Black households are headed by women. And then if you take that and you multiply that by their access to jobs and to security, it translates into, we're gonna have a housing crisis. It's gonna unequally fall on Black women households. It's gonna unequally fall on women-headed households. And so that's something that we just really have to pay attention to. It is not, this is not something that we're gonna have to look at, as Professor Seng said earlier, we're gonna have to look at how we can deal with this at policy levels at home, locally, as opposed to filing complaints and trying to work through that system. By the time we finish the investigation, the family is out in the streets. And so what we need to be thinking about are, how do we address this when the moratorium ends? What is the plan in your community? Do you have in place, have you approached your city about using some of the COVID relief funds to develop a second mortgage program to prevent foreclosures, where the city or town will take a second mortgage out on behalf of the consumers at 100 and below or 80 and below median income, and take a second mortgage out that covers the payments that are late. At this point, we're at 6 months late, right? March, April, May. We're at 4 months. Will it cover 6 months? Will it cover 9 months? And then make that a soft second. That's payable when the home is sold or forgiven after so many years. Do we have in place a rental assistance program that would, again, for lower income families, to keep them stable, agree to pay 6 months for the family, or for a landlord who's suffering, who owns buildings, but he has a mortgage too, providing him with a corporate second so that he can then commit to not putting people out as long as the city helps him make his mortgage payments. We have to be thinking initially about some different things, because filing complaints is not going to solve this problem. Another thing that's coming up is tax valuations. The Federal Reserve says that African American households pay 13% more than white households in taxes, but their market valuations don't reach that. Mothers are home with their kids now that school's starting back. Again, women are disproportionately going to be the ones staying home with the children, homeschooling the children, doing online learning with the children. And if you're doing that, how are you working? And so these are some of the things that we have to deal with. Families are under stress. Families with children are under stress. Women-headed households are under stress. Black, brown, and other communities of color are under stress. And they were already on the brink, and this COVID will push them over if we as a community don't do better by them. They'll be out packing on the streets if we can't come up with creative solutions to deal with this. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Jean, and Lisa, bring it on. I miss you.
I miss you too. Thank you, Stella. And even on the remote screen, you're so dynamic. It's so great to see you. All right, and we're going to move right into the next question and be able to kind of drill down a little bit more into what Stella has been talking about. And so Lisa, terrific to see you. Great to have you here. The question posed for you, again, is very broad. We know now that the pandemic has led to massive unemployment across the nation, and many families are facing eviction and foreclosures, particularly people of color. On its face, this seems like an economic issue, but are you seeing any difference in how landlords and banks are pursuing evictions and foreclosures?
Thank you so much, Jean, for the question, and thank you for inviting me to participate on this very august panel. It's hard to follow Miss Stella Adams, and then I'm going to be, I'm bookended by two powerhouses, Stella and Megan. So I'm just delighted to be here with you all today. And to answer your question, Jean, yes, we are seeing differences, and we're seeing differences for varied reasons. And I want to just take a minute, if you will indulge me, to delve into why we are seeing so many variances and disparities along the lines of race, national origin, and in many cases, gender. So the first thing I think we need to understand is that there are structural inequities that impact this issue. We know that in order for people to make it through the crisis, and I've been saying this everywhere I go, we're facing a triple pandemic. The COVID-19 health crisis, the ensuing economic crisis, and then the crisis of structural racism that has plagued us really since before the inception of this nation. But one of the other things that COVID has done is really expose the inextricable link between health and housing, right? Because in order for us to withstand this crisis, we have to be stably housed. And unfortunately, because of structural issues, everybody is not in the same position to be able to be stably housed. It's just not possible for a disproportionate number of families of color. So first, there are very clear differences in terms of who has access to home ownership and what type of housing people have access to in the United States of America. And that also differences in terms of wealth building opportunities. And this is largely due to discrimination in our marketplace and legacy issues. So for example, 70%, well over 70%, almost 75% of white households are owner occupants, meaning they're homeowners, while just a little over 40% of African Americans, less than 50% of Latinos, and a little over 50% of Native Americans are homeowners. And so what that means is the lion's share of white households are owner occupants, they're homeowners, while the majority of households of color are renters, all right? And this is very dynamic. It's important because of the CARES Act. The CARES Act predominantly provided protections and benefits for homeowners. There are multiple protections in the CARES Act for homeowners. And if we're not careful, if we don't do something, the CARES Act will end up exacerbating and expanding inequality, and in particular, racial inequality. So under the CARES Act, if you are in a federally backed mortgage, you get forbearance, up to a 12-month forbearance if you need it. You have foreclosure protection, so you will not be foreclosed on. So you don't have to make a housing payment, and you will not be foreclosed on. Then after the COVID-19 pandemic ends, there are many options available to homeowners to get them reinstated, to bring them back up to speed in terms of enabling them to catch up on their mortgage. So you can tack the unpaid balance at the end of the loan. You can enter into a loss mitigation plan. There are many options. Not so for renter households. So you see how this dynamic is. The majority of whites are protected from eviction and housing instability, while the majority of households of color are exposed to housing instability, because the CARES Act does not have that many protections for renters. And in fact, the protections for renters have pretty much expired under the CARES Act. There was not this overall sort of reprieve for renters in terms of making housing payments. So while there was a short-term eviction moratorium put in place that has expanded, renters don't get a 12-month forbearance. So what all this means is that, and the other thing that I wanted to add is that due to all of the issues that Stella has just talked about, what we're seeing is that households of color are struggling more to pay their rent. All right, so the latest Census Pulse data shared that, revealed, that 42.2% of Black renters had no or only a slight level of confidence that they would be able to pay their rent in August, compared to 21% of white households who said that they had no or slight confidence that they'd be able to pay their rent. 24% of Black renters indicated that they are confident that they can pay their rent. So 24% of Black households will be able to pay their rent. Almost 50% of white households said, yeah, we're going to be able to pay our rent. So you see, these structural issues have set up this dynamic where what we're seeing today is that people of color disproportionately are experiencing eviction and housing instability, being placed in overcrowded housing situations, and being placed in homeless shelters. So we're seeing huge disparities. There are also disparities in terms of homeowners who are protected under the CARES Act. I won't go into the details there in the interest of time, but suffice it to say that the CARES Act protects about 70% of homeowners. There's about a 30%, that 30% bucket that the CARES Act did not protect. And homeowners of color are disproportionately represented in that 30% that is not protected by the CARES Act. And what that means is homeowners of color are going to disproportionately be facing foreclosure. That is why we really do need to implement a homeowners assistance fund and a rental payment assistance fund that Stella talked about, because we have to make sure that we are protecting everyone in an equal fashion.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And in talking about the struggle that individuals have to pay rent, it has just come to my attention by one of our viewers that today is Equal Pay Day for Black women. So think about that. It's August 13th. That much of the year has already passed. So no wonder there's anxiety, because there is such a difference. It's just the inequity is unbelievable. I think it would be great for us to move right to Megan now to talk more specifically about women, looking at the gender lens, and talk in more detail than the first panel was able to do with respect to sexual harassment. So Megan, I will tee up this question for you, and I certainly would love it if Lisa and Stella would chime in then. Have we seen an increase in sexual harassment allegations and actual claims filed due to an increase in record high unemployment due to COVID-19?
So there is certainly a concern that people are more vulnerable to sexual harassment in housing whenever there's economic pressure. So with the Department of Justice, when we file lawsuits, the aggrieved persons in our cases typically have limited housing options for any number of reasons. They might be single heads of households, single mothers. They might have spotty rental history or a criminal record. They might be recovering from addiction, past victims of sexual violence, and very often we see folks with financial instability. So of course, record high unemployment can exacerbate any of these things, and particularly the financial pressures. The eviction moratoria that have been in place may have given a brief reprieve for a number of people, but obviously as evictions begin to move forward and have now been moving forward, there is definitely a concern that tenants may be more vulnerable to this type of conduct. That's especially true for things like demands for sexual acts in lieu of rent, or demands for sexual acts in lieu of staving off eviction. So tenants who lose their jobs and can't pay their rent, it's tough, right? On the one hand, if they can't pay their rent, then they may not be able to stay in that house. But if they don't have a job, are they going to be able to find other housing? And so it's folks who already have limited options who now may have no other options. And so there's certainly a concern that unscrupulous landlords will take advantage of these circumstances to sexually harass tenants. And there's also a concern that there may be a lot of tenants who feel that they don't have any recourse and that they have to submit to this conduct, otherwise their families will be homeless. The pandemic may also be making people more vulnerable to sexual harassment in housing in other ways. So for example, it might be difficult for a tenant to avoid a harasser when she's staying home more often. friends or family members who might otherwise have visited frequently to, make sure, or spend the night to make sure that the tenant wasn't by herself and kind of didn't, the harasser didn't have that opportunity, may not be willing or able to do so right now. And it may be easier for a harasser to insist that a tenant or even an applicant meet him alone because of social distancing, whether it's, you can't bring someone to pay your rent, or I listed this apartment, but, I'll show it to you, but only you can come. So there are a lot of different ways that, unscrupulous landlords can be taking advantage of this situation. So I know Lisa will talk about some of the data that they've compiled about an uptick in sexual harassment complaints during the pandemic, but there's also a concern about people not reporting harassment that is occurring. Some people might not realize still that this conduct is illegal, and others may just feel like until they have somewhere else to go, they can't report. They either there's just too much going on and they don't feel like they have the capacity, or they're just scared that they're going to lose their housing. And so I think it's also crucial that we all keep up our outreach efforts so that people who are subjected to sexual harassment during this pandemic know that they can report the conduct, that they can report it to fair housing organizations, to FAPS, to HUD, to the Department of Justice. There are a lot of people that will hear these complaints and help them get to the right place. But we need to make sure we're getting out there so that they know to do that reporting and who to reach out to. And then it's crucial when we receive these complaints that we investigate the allegations quickly and thoroughly. So we rarely find that sexual harassment is a one-time occurrence. And in the cases that the Department of Justice brings, we often learn about the harassment because of the experience of one tenant or one applicant. They come to us, they come to HUD, they come to some other advocate. But upon investigating, we often find the harasser has engaged in a pattern or practice and has harassed many tenants over the course of years. So to the extent that victims are delaying reporting during this pandemic for whatever reasons, you may, when you do have investigations, find that there are many victims, but the other victims might be out of time to file their own complaint. And so we encourage you, if you come across that, to let the Department of Justice know. If there are circumstances where it seems clear that a harasser has engaged in a pattern or practice, and particularly if the harasser has somehow exploited the pandemic to further the harassment. The Department of Justice can bring cases, like I said, for a pattern or practice. And in those cases, we can seek relief for people who were harmed further back in time. So as long as we file a timely lawsuit, and for us, that's within 3 years of us learning about the pattern or practice, then we can seek relief for anybody who was injured as part of that pattern or practice, even if their injury was years earlier. So, I know many of you already have relationships with your local U.S. attorney's offices. You can reach out to them. You can reach out to me or my office if you come across situations like this and want to make a referral. So before I turn this over to Lisa and Stella, I wanted to mention just a couple of quick reminders in light of concerns that we often see in the context of sexual harassment in housing matters. And so the first is criminal laws. Some conduct that constitutes sexual harassment under the Fair Housing Act, things like rape and sexual assault, may also violate criminal laws. And so sometimes it might be appropriate to make a referral to local law enforcement, assuming the individual is willing to do so, or, you have other relationships. But don't get too stuck in thinking of criminal law with sexual harassment under the Fair Housing Act either, because there is a wide variety of conduct that may constitute sexual harassment under the Fair Housing Act, even if it doesn't violate criminal law, or even if it does, but the folks you're reporting to don't think it does. So, there is an overlap there, but don't get too stuck in thinking it must be criminal. And the second is the Mrs. Murphy exemption under the Fair Housing Act. So, we often think of it as like, oh, if it's really small housing or it fits the specific definition, there is no claim. And I want to just remind everyone that the Mrs. Murphy exemption is not a complete bar under the Fair Housing Act. It's a limited exemption for only some provisions. And most relevant to sexual harassment complaints, it is not an exemption to 3604C, which is covers discriminatory statements, or to Section 3617, which covers interference, coercion, and intimidation. Both of those provisions often come up in sexual harassment matters, and we often hear about sexual harassment complaints from smaller housing providers and the folks who are living in these much smaller housing, potentially with the harasser right there. You know, they are incredibly vulnerable. So I just wanted to remind everybody to consider whether there are claims under any of the provisions of the Fair Housing Act that are not exempt before, you know, turning something away as non-jurisdictional because of Mrs. Murphy. So I will turn this over to Lisa or Stella, whoever wants to jump in first.
Okay, terrific, Megan. And I just want to accent what you said about DOJ with the pattern or practice cases. That is so important. If we who are in the state and local agencies believe the time has run, you know, think again. There may actually be a perpetrator for whom you can establish a pattern or practice, and that gives you much more time and more to the story. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Lisa, would you like to chime in?
Sure. I just wanted to speak to the question of how many cases we're seeing, or whether or not we're seeing an uptick in sexual harassment cases. For those of you who don't know, the National Fair Housing Alliance is the trade association for fair housing organizations. So that includes private, nonprofit fair housing organizations, as well as FAP organizations. And we did conduct a poll of just our private fair housing organizations. So this poll did not include the FAP organizations. So there's no double counting in the percentages I'm going to give you. Overall, for all cases since the COVID-19 pandemic hit, there was a 30% increase in fair housing cases. There was a 13% increase in sexual harassment cases, and a 16% increase in domestic violence cases. So this issue is very real. It's very palpable for many people. Megan made the point that there's often underreporting in these instances because people are afraid that they're going to lose their housing if they report. And so the education and outreach is really, really critical. And I will share two resources. The National Fair Housing Alliance has partnered both with NAFTA and with other organizations in order to hold education and outreach sessions on sexual harassment. Megan has been so kind as to participate in those training opportunities. And so we have a couple of resources, and I'll pop them in the chat box in case anyone wants to access them.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Lisa. Stella.
So I just want to point out for the investigators a couple of easy places, like this is easy, but there are other data sets that can prove the pattern or practice that you might not think about. And one of those is eviction records. Most landlords, if you're 1 month behind, they will initiate eviction proceedings. Not during this moratorium, but in general, when you're doing a sexual harassment case. Look to see if for the women who are being coerced into trading into a quid pro quo situation in lieu of their rent, they may not face eviction until the 3rd or 4th or 6th month period, whereas there's a consistency that other persons are being evicted after 30 days. That's some evidence that is objective that might be helpful to you in your investigations. It will also help you identify some other potential victims as well if you look into those records. So I just wanted to point that out. And then the other thing I wanted to point out, and I'm thankful that Lisa brought it up, is that the domestic violence issue can have a double whammy effect on women, particularly if you have communities where police calls to your apartment is a grounds for eviction. Many women won't report the domestic violence because they don't want to have the police come to the home and then they face eviction because of it. And so that's something where you can look at the landlord, and this COVID has cramped us all up into our homes for long periods of time. And it's frustrating just being in the house with the husband and kids in general. But if you are in a domestic violence situation, this is not the best environment, where there might be job loss, where there might be close contact. And so it's not just sexual harassment that we need to be paying attention to, but we also need to be looking at victims of domestic violence and how we can assist them as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Stella. And I think it's important for us to note the distinction with respect to evictions, the distinction between federal law and state law. I know the first panel was talking about what will happen when the moratoria come to an end, and states are treating that differently. And so many of our states and localities have been really just trying very quickly to come up with rental assistance, those kinds of things. But it's important, I think, for all of our listeners to understand the distinction between a moratorium that's passed, that's federal law, and one that's passed in your own state, and to be careful about that. And everything that you have said, the three of you have said, and what our previous panelists have talked about, I think the consistent theme is the challenge for all of us in how to really help people and how to come up with a remedy. It's one thing for us to file a charge. It takes time for a discrimination charge. And so I'd love to have some input from you on practical suggestions for how we can partner or link with legal aid providers, other policymakers, nonprofits. How can we do that right now, even remotely, to literally craft solutions that help people while we're doing this important discrimination work that arguably takes too much time to really see the results? I'll start with you, Lisa.
Sure. One of the tools I don't want us to forget about, particularly in issues where consumers need immediate assistance, is prompt judicial action. This is a tool that we have not utilized much. And if there is a reason that we cannot use prompt judicial action, we may be able to go into court in partnership, as you mentioned, Jean, with legal aid organizations or with our bevy of pro bono attorneys to get a temporary restraining order. In many cases that I've worked on, that sometimes provides a great opportunity for you to reach a resolution and not have to even go through, the full step of the investigation, which can, as you said, take a long time. But let's not forget about that tool. It's an immediate tool. It's a tool that we can use to stave off eviction. It's a tool that we can use to try and get victims who are subjected to sexual harassment to get them relief more quickly. And so we just need to remember that that tool is available to us. Now, in order to use the tool, we need to have relationships established, pre-established. And the tool doesn't work if we don't know one another. And so I want to encourage us to reach out to one another more, reach across the aisle, establish those relationships so that when the consumers come to us and they need that assistance, we're ready to go.
Excellent advice. Stella, do you have some words of wisdom for our listeners?
Again, I encourage folks, particularly those on this call, to think about local solutions. If your local government agency or your state agency received COVID-19 funds for housing. Think about deploying that housing in a way that provides, that will pay. The city of Austin, Texas, I don't know if there's a representative on the call, but they have developed a rental assistance program where they'll pay up to 6 months rent if you're 30% or below income. And they have a formula where they're going to provide this rental assistance to keep people in their homes, hoping that by the time that's done, that folks can get back on their feet. We need to be vigilant about looking at how we can use the tools we have available to us fully, as Lisa discussed, fully utilizing the tools in our tool belt to assist people in the now. I love novel stuff, you know that. I love fresh snow. I love getting out here and beating up on folks. That's just me. But I never do it at the expense of saving someone's home, of making sure they have a safe roof over their head. And so we need to have a campaign, not amongst ourselves, but amongst the public, to let them know that we are here to help them if they're facing sexual harassment. Most women don't know that they have an option to make the phone call. They don't know where to go. That we're here to help them with domestic violence. If the landlord is trying to evict them because they call the police to protect their family, we need to let landlords know you can't do that. We need to be doing education and outreach locally. We need to be working with the policymakers and establishing programs that keep people in their housing now. And I am not a friend of forbearance, because at some point you got to pay the piper. And we got to figure out, okay, so we got a 6 months moratorium. At the end of that, do they have to pay 6 months? No, we're going to give them a 6 month pay plan. So it doubles their rent. They couldn't pay the rent before. We have to think about this and figure out ways to abate the rent. How can we assist in abating the rent? How can we get local policy leaders, foundations to help us help the people in our community? We don't need if Congress is not going to give us a global solution, we need to save the people in our neighborhood. And that's a smaller bite of the apple where we can maybe find the resources locally to do.
Great advice. And Megan, one last word, because it can be daunting for individual investigators to think about contacting DOJ. What's the best route to get to these kinds of assistance that you provide?
Reach out to me.
Okay.
We have our regular DOJ website. We also have set up a web page specifically about sexual harassment in housing that is targeted more toward individuals who have experienced it, or the advocates who they might have reported to. And I encourage folks to look there. There's more information about what our process is like. There's ways to get in touch with us directly. And there's also a video on there about what it was like for 3 women to work with us in reporting sexual harassment that had happened to them. And so I understand, I understand it can be scary to think, can I really call the Department of Justice? But you can, the public can as well. And so, you can reach out to me if you have a referral. You can reach out through the website as well.
Terrific, thank you. And for all of you, the message that we just heard from Stella, that's the relationships. It's all about the relationships, building those relationships, having a campaign of education and outreach. All 3 of you have just provided such valuable information. And although you're esteemed experts, you are accessible, and we treasure that. That is so fantastic for all of our state and local agencies. It's truly a gift that you share with us. So thank you for sharing with us again today. And in the interest of time, I would like to turn this back to Melody Taylor, who's going to share In a few minutes, just some exciting news about the National Fair Housing Training Academy. Thank you again.
Great. Start my video. Having a couple of technology glitches here myself. Good afternoon again. Thank you, Jean. You made a very important point that all the people who have been on the call today are accessible. They continue to support fair housing strong and true, and I personally appreciate those relationships and the continued support that IAOHRA has given to the department and to the National Fair Housing Academy post and present day National Fair Housing Academy. So thank you. I want to thank President Toma, Director Valenti, yourself for this invitation, which allowed the department on behalf of the Academy to participate and partner in such a robust information-filled webinar. Again, IAOHRA remains a committed partner in educating and increasing the skills of fair housing and human rights workers throughout the country, and for this, we're greatly appreciative. I'd also like just to add a couple comments. The issues presented today are deeply important, I think, to the ever closing doors to communities of color, and that we have to continue to create strategies to opening doors and recognizing that collectively we have the power to build a movement through these moments, because they're hard, they're tough, they're things we're working through, we're learning, and we're growing. And it takes me to the importance of the National Fair Housing Training Academy. Today, at the start of the session, although I don't think we could really hear the Assistant Secretary, Ana Maria Farías, she talked about HUD's priorities as it relates to the National Fair Housing Training Academy and HUD in general. And part of what we're doing is to build the knowledge, skills, and capacity of fair housing practitioners nationwide, to grow our next and future generations of persons who are going to be doing this work. So it's important for us to succession plan, to knowledge transfer, and we want to do that through modernizing and creating innovations through the Training Academy. Many of the folks on the webinar today have availed themselves to the Academy in planning and curriculum development. And so I just wanted to give a shameless plug to Jeffrey, May, and to Steve Tomkoviak, to Stella, to Lisa, to Kenya Roberts. They have been in the trenches with myself and others working on developing curriculum that we are going to be able to deliver beginning August 24th through the 27th, which will be our first course offering on the basics of fair housing. We also have designed and developed curriculum relating to the fundamentals of fair housing intake, fair housing investigations, and we're going to have a fair housing for litigators course that will be offered between August and December. And in between the time, we're working with Lisa and NAFTA and others to develop fair housing forums. Many of you participated in the most recent forums that we had on sexual harassment, and we're going to continue to do those to educate and to create opportunities for think tanks, for strategies, and to better understand how we can do our work better and how we can better serve the communities. So again, I'd like to thank Jean, you and others for creating this opportunity for HUD and for the Academy to participate and to continue to grow our agencies and partner. Thank you.
Thank you. And IAOHRA, on behalf of the board, I just want to say how honored we are to partner with HUD. And now I'll turn it back to Robin Toma.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you, Melody. It's been an amazing afternoon, late morning for us on the West Coast. You know, it's really, I do need to say thank you to Director Melody Taylor for their partnership and leadership of the National Fair Housing Training Academy, and for this entire day. Now, I want to also recognize that you know, we had such a wonderful array of speakers. They shared such valuable perspectives, expertise, and wisdom today. And the moderators did a fabulous job in framing the discussion and really bringing up salient points. So I'm sure that if we were in person, you would hear the loud applause throughout the day. But unfortunately, that's one of the downsides of these virtual meetings. We know that that if there had been that in-person presence, that you would be hearing the deep appreciation for all that you've done today. Let me just point out for you some of the highlights of today, just really quickly. So, the first panel, Paul Valenti and his panel shared some of the housing discrimination cases that are unique to COVID-19. And that's going to be valuable given the continuing nature of this pandemic, unfortunately, and especially important when the eviction moratoria ends. We also saw in the second panel the valuable information about the fact that 2/3 of the increase in complaints have occurred during COVID-19 based on disability, race and national origin, and families with children, as well as other protected classes. I saw someone mention that sexual harassment being one of them that has occurred and they've seen during this time period. And clearly those are communities we need to protect. We heard from Stella about the New York Fed data on the clear disparate impact of COVID on small business failures that has fallen hardest on people of color, especially Black women. Lisa Rice pointed out the structural inequities that are baked into the CARES Act, where it's giving greater protections to homeowners versus renters, and the majority of homeowners being white and majority of renters being people of color. We heard from Megan White-Vasquez from the DOJ, the vulnerability of women to sexual harassment during this period and their struggle just to keep housing. So there was also the point that, when these complaints happen, there has to be quick and thorough investigation. We know about the digital divide that the panelists also told us about, so we cannot rely solely on electronic communication. We have to also use the good old phone and other means to ensure that we're not, in effect, discriminating against those complainants who don't have access to the internet as easy. And we know that all our panelists have really offered to make these resources that they have and other toolboxes available to all of you. And that's through our chat, through our website, through their websites. We also heard about the double whammy that's affecting those dealing with domestic violence during this current pandemic. And we know that our job is, hearing all of this, we have to not only look to our local governments for solutions, we have to use all the tools that we have available and work with local policymakers to make sure that there's going to be fairness when the different protections end. And we have to make sure that we protect people in getting the most basic of needs met, which is having housing over their head. So with that, I want to express that it was so important to have our HUD partners here today, Assistant Secretary Farías and Director Pelletier. And I'm so sorry that we didn't have good sound with Assistant Secretary Farías. I know that folks will follow up in terms of going to their website to learn more about the priorities of HUD and the FHO. I also want to express appreciation to all of you who have really hung with us today. We had over 600 at the start and throughout most of the day. And I want to, tell you that we want to hear your feedback about our session today. What did we do well? What could we do better? So you will be receiving an evaluation feedback survey, and we want to really ask that you take a few minutes to respond to that and help us make these events even stronger. Now, everyone, I'm sure, knows that this could not happen without many people involved, but I want to recognize IAOHRA board members and human rights leaders, Paul Valenti and Jean Kelleher, who were leaders in organizing this event. They had a fantastic team who made it happen. There were board members and volunteers, Angie Rush, Gwendolyn Wiggin, Diane Clements-Boyd, Kyla Hennington, IAOHRA staff Lisa Sims, and many others. My apologies for anyone I've missed. But without them, we couldn't have done this event today. And just to mention, this conference is our second one, a follow-up to our first gathering online, which we explored the range of human and civil rights issues that have been raised by both the pandemic and the protest scene nationally and globally. And today's was our first to do a deeper dive into one of those major civil and human rights issues that threaten our communities during this historic period. So I want to ask you to stay tuned on what we are going to bring in the future. Join IAOHRA at IAOHRA.org. There's never been a time when there has been such a great need for our network, and we invite you to become a member. So With that, I want to close our session today in honor of civil rights giants John Lewis and Reverend C.T. Vivian, who passed away in the recent period. And I will say that I had the pleasure of meeting Reverend C.T. Vivian at an IAOHRA conference many years ago, and is one of the great thrills of my life. But I also want to mention that there are many who sacrifice that are both known and unknown, famous or not. And I think that all of us, if we think about our local communities, our local heroes, we should rededicate ourselves to the common values, principles, and mission that we all share. So to the goal that we're not going to allow the racial divisions, the pandemic, nor the presidential election campaign prevent us from doing all that we can to uphold the fundamental human right to housing without discrimination for everyone. I want to close us this session and say that, don't forget to be counted in the census, help those be counted in the census, help get out the vote. And on behalf of the entire IAOHRA board of directors and supporters, we will close today wishing you the best, to you, your team, your family, and your communities. Stay safe and healthy, stay connected, and stay strong. Thank you.